Born Free by Joy Adamson. For many years, my home has been in the northern frontier province of Kenya, that vast stretch of semi-arid thorn bush covering some 120,000 square miles, which extends from Mount Kenya to the Abyssinian border. Civilization has made little impact on this part of Africa. There are no settlers. The local tribes live very much as their forefathers did, and the place abounds in wildlife of every description. My husband, George, is senior game warden of this huge territory, and our home is on the southern border of the province, near Isiolo, a small township of about 30 whites, all of whom are government officials engaged in the task of administering the territory. George has many duties, such as enforcing the game laws, preventing poaching, and dealing with dangerous animals that have molested the tribesmen. His work causes him to travel over tremendous distances, and whenever possible, I accompany him on these trips. In this way, I have had unique opportunities of coming to grips with this wild, unchanged land, where life is tough and nature asserts her own laws. This story has its beginning on one of these safaris. A Baran tribesman had been killed by a man-eating lion. It was reported to George that this animal, accompanied by 2 lionesses, was living in some nearby hills, and so it became his duty to track them down. This was why we were camping far to the north of Isiolo, among the Baran tribesmen. Early on the morning of the 1st of February 1956, I found myself in camp alone with Patty, a rock hyrax who'd been living with us as a pet for 6.5 years. She looked like a marmot or a guinea pig, though zoologists will have it that on account of the bone structure of its feet and teeth, the hyrax is most nearly related to rhinos and elephants. Suddenly I heard the vibrations of a car. This could only mean that George was returning much earlier than expected. Soon our Land Rover broke through the thorn bush and stopped near our tents, and I heard George shout, "Joy, where are you? Quick, I've something for you." I rushed out, with Patty on my shoulder, and saw the skin of a lion. But before I could ask about the hunt, George pointed to the back of the car. There were 3 lion cubs, tiny balls of spotted fur, each trying to hide its face from everything that went on. They were only a few days old, and their eyes were still covered with a bluish film. They could hardly crawl, nevertheless they tried to creep away. I took them on my lap to comfort them, while George, who was most distressed, told me what had happened. Towards dawn, he and another game warden, Ken, had been guided near to the place where the man-eater was said to lie up. When first light broke, they were charged by a lioness, who rushed out from behind some rocks. Though they had no wish to kill her, she was very close, and the way back was hazardous. So George signaled Ken to shoot, and he hit and wounded her. The lioness disappeared, and when they went forward, they found a heavy trail of blood leading upwards. Cautiously, step by step, they went over the crest of the hill till they came to a huge flat rock. George climbed onto it to get a better view, while Ken skirted around below. Then he saw Ken peer under the rock, pause, raise his rifle, and fire both barrels. There was a growl. The lioness appeared and came straight at Ken. George could not shoot, for Ken was in his line of fire. Fortunately, a game scout, who was in a more favorable position, fired his rifle and caused the animal to swerve. Then George was able to kill her. She was a big lioness in the prime of life, her teats swollen with milk. It was only when he saw this that George realized why she'd been so angry and faced them so courageously. Then he blamed himself for not having recognized earlier that her behavior showed she was defending her litter. Now he ordered a search to be made for the cubs. Presently he and Ken heard slight sounds coming out of a crack in the rock face. They put their arms down the crevice as far as they could reach. Loud infantile growls and snarls greeted this unsuccessful maneuver. Next they cut a long hooked stick, and after a lot of probing managed to drag the cubs out. They were carried to the car, where the 2 biggest growled and spat during the whole of the long journey back to camp. The third, and smallest, however, offered no resistance and seemed quite unconcerned. To my amazement, Patty, who was usually very jealous of any rival, soon came to nestle among them, and obviously accepted them as desirable companions. From that day onwards, the four became inseparable. During these early days, Patty was the biggest of the company, and also, being 6 years old, was very dignified compared with the clumsy little velvet bags who couldn't walk without losing their balance. It was 2 days before the cubs accepted their first milk. Until then, whatever trick I tried to make them swallow diluted, unsweetened milk only resulted in their pulling up their tiny noses and protesting. Once they'd accepted the milk, they could not get enough of it, and every 2 hours I had to warm it and clean the flexible rubber tube which we'd taken from the wireless set to serve as a teat until we were able to get a proper baby's bottle. We'd sent at once to the nearest African market, which was about 50 miles away, not only for the teat but also for cod liver oil, glucose, and cases of unsweetened milk, and had at the same time sent an SOS to the district commissioner at Isiolo, about 150 miles away, announcing the arrival there within a fortnight of 3 royal babies, and asking him to be good enough to have a comfortable wooden home made in time for our return. Within a few days, the cubs had settled down and were everybody's pets. Patty, their most conscientious, self-appointed nanny, remained in charge. She was devoted to them, and never minded being pulled and trodden on by the 3 fast-growing little bullies. All the cubs were females. Even at this age, each had a definite character. The big one had a benevolent superiority and was generous towards the others. The second was a clown, always laughing and spanking her milk bottle with her front paws as she drank, her eyes closed in bliss. I named her Lustica, which means the jolly one. The third cub was the weakling in size, but the pluckiest in spirit. She pioneered all round and was always sent by the others to reconnoitre when something looked suspicious to them. I called her Elsa, because she reminded me of someone of that name. The quartet, Patty and the 3 cubs, spent most of the day in the tent under my camp bed. This evidently seemed to them a safe place, and the nearest thing they could find to their natural nursery. They were by nature house-trained and always took great care to reach the sand outside. There were a few accidents during the first days, but afterwards, on the rare occasions when a little pool disgraced their home, they meowed and made comical grimaces of disgust. In every way they were wonderfully clean, and had no smell except for a very pleasant one like honey or cod liver oil. Their tongues were already as rough as sandpaper. As they grew older, we could feel them, even through our khaki clothes, when they licked us. When, after 2 weeks, we returned to Isiolo, our royal babies had a palace awaiting them. Everyone came to see them, and they received a royal welcome. They loved Europeans, and especially small children, but had a marked dislike of Africans. The only exception was a young Somali called Nuru. He was our garden boy. Now we appointed him guardian and lion-keeper-in-chief. The post pleased him, for it raised his social status. For 12 weeks we kept them on a diet of unsweetened milk mixed with cod liver oil, glucose, bone meal, and a little salt. Soon they showed us that they only required 3 hourly feeds, and then gradually the intervals became longer. By now their eyes were fully opened, but they could not yet judge distances and often missed their target. To help them over this difficulty, we gave them rubber balls and old inner tubes to play with. The latter were perfect for tug-of-war games. Indeed, anything made of rubber, or that was soft and flexible, fascinated them. They would try to take the inner tube from each other, the attacker rolling sideways onto the possessor, pressing her weight between the end of the tube and its owner. Surprise was the most important element in all their games. They stalked each other and us from the earliest age, and knew by instinct how to do it properly. They always attacked from the rear. Keeping under cover, they crouched, then crept slowly towards the unsuspecting victim until the final rush was made at flying speed, and resulted in the attacker landing with all her weight on the back of her quarry, throwing it to the ground. When we were the object of such an attack, we always pretended to be unaware and looked the other way until the final onslaught took place. This delighted the cubs. Patty always wanted to be in the game, though as the cubs were soon 3 times her size, she took good care to keep out of the way of heavy spankings and to avoid being squashed by her charges. In all other circumstances, She retained her authority by sheer character. If the cubs became too aggressive, she put them in their places by just turning round and facing them. I admired her spirit. For small as she was, it needed a lot of courage to convince them of her fearlessness. The more so that her only defences were her sharp teeth, quick reactions, intelligence, and pluck. As the lions became increasingly aware of their strength, they tested it on everything they could find. For instance, a ground sheet, however large, had to be dragged about, and they would set to work in proper feline fashion, placing it under their bodies and pulling it between their front legs, as in later life they would drag a kill. Another favourite game was King of the Castle. A cub would jump onto a potato sack and keep her attacker at bay until she was suddenly dethroned by the other sister coming up from behind. The victor was usually Elsa, who, seeing the other two locked in combat, made the most of her opportunity. Our few banana trees were also regarded as delightful toys, and very soon their luxuriant leaves hung in tattered fringes. Tree climbing was another favourite game. The little lions were born acrobats, but often they ventured so high that they could not turn to come down, and we were obliged to rescue them. When at dawn Nuru let them out, they shot out of doors with a whole night's pent-up energy, and this moment could be compared to the start of a greyhound race. On one such occasion, they spotted a tent in which two men who'd come to visit us were staying. Within 5 minutes, it was a wreck, and we were wakened by the cries of our guests, who were vainly trying to rescue their belongings, while the cubs, wild with excitement, dived into the wreckage and reappeared with a variety of trophies: slippers, pyjamas, shreds of mosquito netting. We had to enforce discipline that time with a small stick. Putting them to bed was also no mean task. Imagine 3 very naughty little girls, who, like all children, hated bedtime, but who could run twice as fast as those who were in charge of them, and had the added advantage of being able to see in the dark. Outdoor games were all very well, but the cubs also developed a fancy for books and cushions. So to save our library and other possessions, we were eventually obliged to ban them from the house. To effect this, we made a shoulder-high door of strong wire on a wooden frame, and placed it across the entrance to the veranda. The cubs resented it very much, so to compensate them for their lost playground, we hung a tire from a tree, and this proved to be grand for chewing and also as a swing. When the cubs were 3 months old, they had teeth big enough to make it possible for them to eat meat. So now I gave them raw minced meat, which was the best we could do to imitate their mother's regurgitated food. For several days they refused to touch it and pulled grimaces of disgust. Then Lustica made the experiment and found it to her taste. The others took courage from her, and soon there was a fight at every meal. This meant that poor Elsa, who was still weaker than the others, had little chance of getting her fair share. So I kept the titbits for her, and used to take her onto my lap for her meals. She loved this. Rolling her head from side to side and closing her eyes, she showed how happy she was. At these times she would suck my thumbs and massage my thighs with her front paws, as though she were kneading her mother's belly in order to get more milk. It was during these hours that the bond between us developed. We combined playing with feeding, and my days were happily spent with these charming creatures. They were lazy by nature, and it needed a lot of persuasion to get them to move from a comfortable position. Even the most desirable marrowbone was not worth the effort of getting up, and they would roll into position to get at it by the easiest way. But best of all, they liked me to hold their bone for them while they lay on their backs, paws in the air, and sucked at it. When the cubs went into the bush, they often had adventures. One morning I was following them, for I'd given them a little worming powder and wanted to see the result. I saw them a little way off, asleep. Suddenly 5 donkeys approached, and the cubs woke up. This was the first time they'd seen such a big animal, and they certainly showed the proverbial courage of a lion, for they all charged simultaneously. This put them into such good heart that when a few days later our 40-pack donkeys and mules came near the house, the 3 little lions fearlessly put the whole cavalcade to flight. At 5 months, they were in splendid condition and getting stronger every day. They were quite free except at night, when they slept in an enclosure of rock and sand which led off from their wooden shelter. This was a necessary precaution, for wild lions, hyenas, jackals, and elephants frequently roam round our house, and any of these might have killed them. The more we grew to know the cubs, the more we loved them, so it was hard to accept the fact that we could not keep forever 3 fast-growing lions. Regretfully, we decided that 2 must go, and that it would be better that the 2 big ones, who were always together and less dependent on us than Elsa, should be the ones to leave. Our African servants agreed with our choice. When asked their opinion, they unanimously chose the smallest. Perhaps they were influenced by visions of the future, and thought, if there must be a lion in the household, then let it be as small as possible. As to Elsa, we felt that if she'd only ourselves as friends, she would be easy to train, not only for life at Isiolo, but also as a travelling companion on our safaris. As the home for Lustica and the big one, we chose the Rotterdam Blijdorp Zoo and made arrangements for them to make the journey by air. We padded the car with soft sandbags, and when we drove off, Elsa ran a short way down the drive and then stood with the most mournful expression in her eyes, watching the car in which her 2 sisters were disappearing. I travelled in the back with the cubs. After an hour of restlessness, they lay quietly on the bags beside me, embracing me with their paws. We travelled like this for 11 hours, delayed by 2 blowouts. The lions could not have been more trusting. When we reached Nairobi, they looked at me with their large eyes, puzzled to know what to make of all the strange noises and smells. Then the plane carried them off forever from their native land. After a few days, we received a cable announcing the safe arrival of our cubs in Holland. When I visited them, about 3 years later, they accepted me as a friendly person and allowed me to stroke them, but they did not recognize me. They lived in splendid conditions, and on the whole, I was glad to know that almost certainly they had no recollection of a freer life. While I was absent in Nairobi, George told me that Elsa was very much upset and never left him for a moment. She followed him around, sat under his office desk where he was working, and at night slept on his bed. Each evening he took her for a walk, but on the day of my return she refused to accompany him and sat herself down expectantly in the middle of the drive. Nothing could move her. Could it have been that she knew I was coming back? If so, to what animal instincts can one attribute such foreknowledge? When I arrived, alone, she gave me a great welcome, but it was heartbreaking to see her searching everywhere for her sisters. For many days to come, she gazed into the bush and called for them. She followed us everywhere, evidently fearing that we too might desert her. To reassure her, we kept her in the house. She slept on our bed, and we were often woken by her rough tongue licking our faces. As soon as we could make the necessary arrangements, we took her on safari, in order to break this atmosphere of waiting and distress, and luckily she took to all that safari means and loved it as much as we did. My truck, packed with soft luggage and bedding rolls, was ideal for her to travel in, since from a comfortable couch she could watch all that was going on. We camped by the Wajaneiro River, whose banks are lined with doom palms and acacia bush. In the dry season, the shallow waters flow slowly down to the Lorien swamp, passing some rapids and forming many deep pools which are full of fish. Near our camp there were rocky ridges. Elsa explored their clefts, sniffed among the rocks, and usually ended by settling herself on the top of some rock from which she could survey the surrounding bush. In the late afternoon the sun turned the country into a blaze of warm colours. Then she blended into the reddish stone, as though she were a part of it. It is very hot at that season, so Elsa spent part of the day in the water. Then, when the sun made this uncomfortable for her, she would rest in the reeds, at intervals rolling lazily into the river, where she landed with a great splash. She was always full of mischief. Sharing her fun with us, she would splash us whenever she found us off our guard, or she would jump quickly out of the water, pounce on us, wet as she was, and we'd find ourselves rolling in the sand with our cameras, field glasses, and rifles pressed down by her heavy, dripping body. She used her paws in a variety of ways. She would use them in gentle caresses, but she could also deliver a playful, well-aimed smack at full speed, and she knew a little jiu-jitsu trick which unfailingly laid us flat on our backs. No matter how prepared we were for the act, she would give just a small twist to our ankles with her paw, and down we went. She was very particular about her claws. Certain trees with a rough bark provided her with a means of sharpening them, and she scratched away, leaving deep lines, until she was satisfied with the result of the operation. One afternoon, Elsa rushed off into the bush, attracted by the noise of elephant. Soon we heard loud trumpetings and screams, and the cackling of guinea-fowl as well. In great excitement we awaited the outcome of this meeting. After a while the elephant noises ceased, but to make up for it, the guinea-fowl raised a most alarming clatter. Then, to our amazement, Elsa emerged from a thicket, closely followed by a flock of vulturine guinea-fowl, who seemed determined to chase her away, for whenever she made an attempt to sit down, they chuckled and cackled, so that she just had to keep going. Only after these bold birds became aware of our presence was she allowed some peace. During one of our walks, Elsa suddenly froze in front of a cluster of sansevieria bush, then leapt in the air and retreated hastily, giving us a look which seemed to say, "Why don't you do like me?" At this moment we saw a large snake between the pointed, sword-sharp sansevieria leaves. It was well protected in the impenetrable thicket of blades, and we thanked Elsa for her warning. When we returned to Isiolo, the rains had started. The country was covered with little rivulets and pools. This provided fine fun for Elsa. She splashed in every one of them, and, greatly invigorated, proceeded with pouncing leaps to cover us with what she evidently considered to be heavenly mud. This was beyond a joke. We had to make her realize that she'd grown too heavy for such light-hearted flying jumps. We explained the situation to her by the judicious use of a small stick. She understood at once, and thereafter we very seldom had to make use of it, though we always carried it as a reminder. By now Elsa also understood the meaning of no, and she would obey even when tempted by an antelope. Often it was touching to see her torn between her hunting instinct and her wish to please us. Anything moving seemed to her just asking to be chased, but as yet her instinct to kill had not fully developed. Of course, we'd been careful never to show her goat meat alive. She had plenty of opportunity of seeing wild animals, but as we were usually with her when this happened, she gave chase merely in play, and always came back to us after a short time, rubbed her head against our knees, and told us with a low meow about the game. It was an exciting moment when she met her first elephant, an anxious one, too, for poor Elsa had no mother to warn her against these animals who regard lion as the only enemies of their young, and therefore sometimes kill them. One day, Nuru, who'd taken her out for her morning walk, came back panting to say that Elsa was playing with an elephant. We took our rifles, and he guided us to the scene. There we saw a great old elephant, his head buried in a bush, enjoying his breakfast. Suddenly Elsa, who'd crept up from behind, took a playful swipe at one of his hind legs. A scream of shocked surprise and injured dignity followed this piece of impertinence. Then the elephant backed from the bush and charged. Elsa hopped nimbly out of his way and, quite unimpressed, began to stalk him. It was a very funny, though an alarming sight, and we could only hope that we should not need to use our guns. Luckily, after a time, both became bored with the game. The old elephant went back to his meal, and Elsa lay down close by and went to sleep. During the next few months, the cub took every opportunity that came her way to harry elephant, and there were many such occasions, for the elephant season was beginning. This meant an annual invasion by herds numbering several hundred animals. One day, at noon, Nuru and Elsa returned home, followed by a large number of elephants. From our dining-room window we could see them in the bush. We tried to divert her attention, but she turned and was determined to meet the advancing herd. Then, suddenly, she sat down and watched them as they turned away and walked in single file across the rifle range. It was a grand parade as one after another emerged from the bush in which Elsa crouched, giving them her scent. She waited until the last of about 20 elephants had crossed. Then she followed them slowly, her head held in a straight line with her shoulders, her tail outstretched. Suddenly the big bull in the rear turned, and jerking his massive head at Elsa, screamed with a high-pitched, trumpeting sound. This war cry did not intimidate her, and she walked determinedly on. So did the big elephant. We went out, and following cautiously, saw glimpses of Elsa and the elephants mingling together in the undergrowth. There were no screams, nor any sound of breaking branches, which would have indicated trouble. All the same, we waited anxiously until eventually the cub reappeared, looking rather bored with the whole business. But not all the elephants which Elsa met were so amiable as these. On another occasion she succeeded in starting a colossal stampede. The first thing we heard was a tremendous thundering on the rifle range, and when we reached the scene we saw a herd of elephants racing downhill, with Elsa close behind them. Finally she was charged by a single bull, but she was much too quick for him, and in time he gave up the attack and followed his companions. To add to the excitement of Elsa's life, there was now a rhino living close to our house. One evening at dark, when we were returning from a walk, the cub suddenly darted behind the servants' quarters. A tremendous commotion ensued. We went to find out what it was about, and saw Elsa and the rhino facing each other. After a few moments of indecision, the rhino, snorting angrily, retreated with the cub in hot pursuit. The following evening I was walking with Elsa and Nuru. We were late, and it was getting dark, when suddenly the Somali grabbed my shoulder, thus preventing me from walking straight into the rhino, which stood behind a bush, facing us. I leapt back and ran. Luckily Elsa, who'd not seen the rhino, thought I was playing a game and followed me. This was fortunate, for rhinos are unpredictable creatures who are apt to charge anything, including lorries and trains. The next day, however, Elsa had her fun. She chased the animal for 2 miles across the valley, Nuru loyally panting behind her. After this experience, the rhino took itself off to quieter quarters. By now we had established a routine for Elsa. The mornings were cool. It was then that we often watched the impala antelope gracefully leaping on the rifle range and listened to the chorus of the awakening birds. As soon as it got light, Nuru released Elsa, and both walked a short distance into the bush. The cub, full of unspent energy, chased everything she could find, including her own tail. Then, when the sun got warm, she and Nuru settled under a shady tree, and Elsa dozed while he read his Koran and sipped tea. Nuru always carried a rifle to protect them both against wild animals, but was very good about following our instructions to shout before shooting. He was genuinely fond of Elsa and handled her very well. About tea-time, the two of them returned and we took over. First, Elsa had some milk. Then we wandered into the hills or walked in the plain. She climbed trees, appeared to sharpen her claws, followed exciting scents, or stalked Grant's gazelle and Gerenuk, which sometimes played hide-and-seek with her. Much to our surprise, she was fascinated by tortoises, which she rolled over and over. She loved playing, and never did she miss an opportunity of starting a game with us. We were her pride, and she shared everything with us. As darkness fell, we returned home, and took her to her enclosure where her evening meal awaited her. It consisted of large quantities of raw meat, mostly sheep and goat. She got her roughage by breaking up the rib bones and the cartilages. As I held her bones for her, I would watch the muscles on her forehead moving powerfully. I always had to scratch the marrow out for her. She licked it greedily from my fingers, resting her heavy body upright against my arms. While this went on, Patty sat on the window-sill, watching us, content to know that soon her turn would come to to spend the night cuddled round my neck, and that then she would have me to herself. Till then, I sat with Elsa, playing with her, sketching her, or reading. These evenings were our most intimate time, and I believe that her love for us was mostly fostered in these hours when, fed and happy, she could doze off with my thumb still in her mouth. It was only on moonlight nights that she became restless. Then she padded along the wire, listening intently, her nostrils quivering to catch the faintest scent which might bring a message from the mysterious night outside. Elsa was now a year old. She'd lost her baby teeth, and I'd been allowed to wiggle out one milk canine, while she helpfully held her head quite still. Patty was now getting old, and I kept her as quiet as I could. Our local leave was due, and we planned to spend it by the sea, on a remote part of the coast, close to a small Barjun fishing village, and not far from the Somali border. The nearest white population was 90 miles south in Lamu. It would be a perfect place for Elsa, for we could camp on the beach, away from people, with miles of clean sand around us, and a bushy hinterland behind would provide shade. We took 2 friends with us, one a young district officer, Don, and the other Herbert, an Austrian writer who was our guest. It was a long journey over bad tracks, and it took us 3 days. I usually went ahead with Elsa in my truck, George and the others following in 2 Land Rovers with Patty. One day the road became a network of camel spoor. When it was getting dark, I lost my way, ran out of petrol, and hoping that George would follow my tracks, waited for him. Only after several hours did I see his lights. When he arrived, he said that our camp was already pitched some miles away, and told me we must hurry back, as he'd left Patty very ill with heat-stroke. He had given her some brandy to strengthen her, but had little hope. The miles back to the camp seemed endless to me. I found Patty in a coma. Her heart was beating so rapidly that it was improbable that it would stand the strain much longer. Gradually she became semi-conscious, recognized me, and made a weak attempt to grind her teeth. This had always been her way of showing her affection. It was her last message to me. Later she grew calm, and her heart slowed down till it had almost ceased to beat. And suddenly her little body quivered in a last convulsion, stretched stiffly, and collapsed. Patty was dead. I held her close. Her warm body took a long time to cool. I thought of the many moments of happiness she'd given me in the 7.5 years during which we'd shared our lives. On how many safaris had she been my companion? How tolerant she was of the bush babies, squirrels and mongooses, which came and went in our household, and how she loved the lions. At meals she sat by my plate and took the titbits gently from my hand. She had become part of me. Now I wrapped her in a cloth, fastened her harness and leash round it, and carried her some distance away from the camp. Here I dug her grave. The night was hot, and the moonlight softened the shadows in the wide plain around us. All was still, and so peaceful. The next morning we drove on, and I was glad that the bad road held my attention. It was late afternoon when we reached the coast. As soon as the sun was up the next morning, the whole camp trooped down to the water's edge to introduce Elsa to the Indian Ocean. The tide was receding. At first she was nervous of the unaccustomed roar and rush of the waves. Then she sniffed cautiously at the water, bit at the foam, and finally put her head down to drink. But her first mouthful of salt water made her wrinkle her nose and pull grimaces of disgust. However, when she saw the rest of the party enjoying a bathe, she decided to trust us and join in the fun. Very soon she became quite water-crazy. Rain pools and shallow rivers had always excited and invigorated her, but this great ocean was a real haven for her. She swam effortlessly, far out of her depth, ducked us and splashed the water with her tail, and ensured that we too swallowed mouthfuls of salt water before we were able to escape from her antics. She followed us everywhere, so I usually stayed behind when the others went fishing. Otherwise she would have swum out after the boat. She loved walking along the beach, where she chased the coconuts bobbing in the surf, getting splashed and swamped by the waves in the process. Sometimes we tied a string to a coconut and swung it in a circle above our heads, while she jumped high up after it as it flew past. She soon discovered that digging in the sand was a most rewarding game, since the deeper the hole, the wetter and cooler it became, and therefore the nicer to roll in. Often she dragged long strands of seaweed along, entangling herself in it till she looked like some odd sea monster. Feeding Elsa became quite a problem, for the local fishermen were quick to recognize the source of income which she represented, and the price of goats soared. In fact, for some time she kept the villagers in luxuries hitherto unknown to them. However, in the end, she had her revenge. The herdsmen never guarded their animals, which straggled along all day in the bush, an easy prey to leopard and lion. One evening we were out on the beach, long after bedtime, when Elsa suddenly darted into a bush. There followed a loud bleat, and then silence. She must have scented a lone straggler, pounced on the goat, and squashed it with her weight. But never having killed before, she did not know what to do next, and when we arrived, she plainly asked us for help. While Elsa held the animal down, George quickly shot the beast. As no complaint was made by the owner for its loss, which was no doubt credited to the usual kill of some wild lion, we kept quiet about the incident. Had we done otherwise, every moribund goat from a day's march, north and south of the camp, would have been left out for Elsa to devour, so that compensation might be claimed. We overcame our qualms of conscience with the thought that George had rid the district of its chief goat-eater, and also with the recollection of the exorbitant prices we'd paid for the most miserable little beasts which we'd bought on Elsa's behalf. Like all holidays, this one passed much too quickly, but by the time we went home we had acquired a deep tan, and Elsa, owing to her sea bathing, had developed a beautiful silky coat. Our next safari was to take us to Lake Rudolph, a stretch of brackish water some 180 miles long, reaching to the Ethiopian frontier. We were to be away for 7 weeks, and most of the time we should travel on foot, with pack donkeys and mules. It would be Elsa's first experience of a foot safari in the company of donkeys, and we could only hope that both sides would accept each other. We were quite a party. George and myself, Julian, a game warden from a neighbouring territory, Herbert, who was once again our guest, as well as game scouts, drivers and personal servants, 6 sheep to feed Elsa on the way, and 35 donkeys and mules. The pack animals were sent off 3 weeks ahead to meet us on the shores of the lake, while we travelled the distance of about 300 miles by motor transport. It was a big convoy, 2 Land Rovers, my 1.5-ton truck with Elsa in the back of it, and 2 3-ton lorries. The latter were necessary to enable us to carry, as well as the men, sufficient food and petrol for the weeks we should be away, and also 80 gallons of water. Our first 180 miles led us through the sandy, hot and dusty plains of the Kaisut Desert. Then we ascended the volcanic slopes of the Marsabit Mountain, an isolated volcanic mass rising to 4,500 feet out of the surrounding desert. Clothed in thick, cool, lichen-covered forest, and often enveloped in mist, it presented a welcome contrast to the hot, arid country below. From now on we made our way through practically uninhabited country, and were cut off from any contact with the outside world. Nothing broke the monotony of the sand gullies and lava ridges. Elsa was most cooperative, and although she did not like strange Africans, obligingly put up with the jabbering crowd of our people who pressed close to the car trying to be helpful. We climbed up the most shocking track into the Hurry Hills on the Ethiopian border. These are desolate, and though higher than Marsabit, attract less moisture. An enervating gale blows across their slopes, and in consequence they are barren of forest. Elsa was quite bewildered by the fierce wind, and had to spend the night in the truck, well protected with canvas curtains from its icy blast. George's purpose in visiting these hills was to examine the game situation and to see whether there were any signs of poaching by the Gabba tribesmen. After a few days spent in patrolling the country, we turned westwards, crossing the most depressing, desolate lava country, where sharp rocks jerked the car mercilessly, and Elsa had a tough time as we pushed the vehicles through deep sandy riverbeds or ground our way carefully between boulders, jostling against the large stones. At last we came out onto the Chalby Desert, a dry, ancient lakebed some 80 miles in length, with a smooth, fairly firm surface on which a vehicle can travel at full speed. At the western end of Chalby lies the oasis of North Hoare, where there's a police post, and where thousands of camels, sheep and goats belonging to the Rendili tribe come to water. As there was nothing to keep us at North Hoare, we filled our water containers and continued on our way. At last, after 230 miles of hustling and bumping, we reached Loyongaleni, an oasis of freshwater springs in a grove of doom palms near the south of Lake Rudolph. Here we found our donkeys waiting for us. We took Elsa at once to the lake, which was 2 miles distant. She rushed into the water as though to throw off the strain of the journey, and plunged in, right among the crocodiles, which are very plentiful in Lake Rudolph. Luckily they were not aggressive, but all the same we tried to scare them away. At Loyongaleni we established our base camp, and spent the next 3 days in repairing saddlery and packing donkey loads. At last all was ready. There were 18 donkeys loaded with food and camping gear, 4 with water containers, 1 riding mule for anyone who went weak or lame, and 5 spare donkeys. I was worried about what Elsa's attitude towards the donkeys was going to be. She watched all our repacking with restrained interest. Then when we started loading, she had to be chained up, for the sight of so much lovely meat braying and kicking and rolling in the sand in an endeavour to throw off unwanted burdens made her tense with excitement. The main cavalcade started off in the morning, and we followed with Elsa later in the day when it was cooler. Our march was northwards, along the shoreline. Elsa was very excited, and rushed like a puppy from one to the other of us. Then she dashed in among the flocks of flamingos, retrieved a duck we'd shot, and finally went swimming in the lake, where one of us had to cover her with a rifle on account of the crocodiles. Later, when we passed a herd of camels, I was obliged to put her on the chain. This made her furious, and her efforts to meet these new friends nearly pulled my arms off. I, however, had no wish to see a stampeding, panic-stricken herd of camels falling over each other, bellowing, gurgling, legs intertwined, and Elsa in their midst. Fortunately, these were the last livestock we met along the shore. When night fell, we saw the fires of the camp by the lake. Again, I put Elsa on the chain for fear that she might have enough energy left to chase our donkeys. When we arrived, we found camp already pitched, and everything laid out for dinner. While we had a belated sundowner, we decided that at dawn each morning, the lion party, George and I, Nuru, a game scout as guide, and Elsa, would start off while camp was being struck and the animals saddled and loaded. In this way we would benefit by the cooler hours, and the pack animals would follow at a safe distance, dispensing us from any need to keep Elsa on the chain. Then about 9:30 we would look for a shady place where we could rest during the heat of the day, and where the donkeys could get some grazing. As soon as these were sighted, we would put Elsa on the chain. In the afternoon we would reverse our routine, the donkey party leaving 2 hours before the lion party, and pitching camp before dark. We kept to this routine during the whole safari, and it worked out very well, for it kept Elsa and the donkeys apart, except during the midday rest, when she was chained up and very sleepy. We found that Elsa marched very well until about 9 o'clock in the morning. Then she began to feel the heat, and kept stopping wherever a rock or a bush gave shade. In the afternoon she was reluctant to move before 5. After that, once her pads had hardened, she could have gone on all night. On an average, she trotted from 7 to 8 hours daily and kept in wonderful condition. She dipped herself in the lake and swam as often as possible, often only 6 or 8 feet from the crocodiles. No shouting or waving on my part would bring her back till she felt like doing so. Usually, we reached camp between 8 and 9 in the evening. Often, the donkey party would fire very lights to guide us. The second day out, we left the last human habitation behind us, a small fishing village of the primitive El Molo tribe. The country around was grim, lava and more lava, only the consistency of the lava differing. Sometimes it was cinder-fine dust, at other times sharp-edged, so that our feet became sore from slipping and sliding over the uneven ground. In certain places there was deep sand, and as we waded along, each step was an effort. Or again we had to make our way across coarse grit or pebbles, and at all times the hot wind blew, sapping our energy and making us feel dizzy. There was little vegetation, only a few thorny, meagre plants which pricked, and razor-edged grass which cut the skin. During the midday rest, I usually lay on my camp bed, so as to be able to relax in more comfort than the hard pebbles provided. Elsa saw the point of this, adopted my idea, and joined me. Soon I could consider myself fortunate if she left me a small corner, and sometimes I was unlucky and had to sit on the ground while she stretched herself full length on the bed. But as a rule we curled up together, I hoping that it might not break beneath our combined weight. During our long marches, Nuru always carried drinking water and a bowl for Elsa. She had her evening meal towards 9 o'clock, and afterwards slept heavily, tied up near my bed. One evening we lost our way, and were guided by very lights to the camp, which we reached late at night. Elsa seemed exhausted, so I left her unchained to recover. But although she looked sleepy, she suddenly rushed at full speed to the thorn enclosure in which the donkeys spent the night, and crashed through the fence in real feline style. Braying, panic and pandemonium ensued, and before we could intervene, all the donkeys had bolted into the darkness. Luckily, we soon caught Elsa, and I gave her a good hiding. She seemed to understand that she deserved it, and as far as she could, showed that she was sorry. I felt guilty at having underestimated her natural instinct, and the tremendous temptation that a nice-smelling donkey herd must be to her, especially at an hour when the hunting spirit is most alive in wild animals. Before we reached Alia Bay, some 100 miles to the north, it was necessary to cross the long Longondoti Range. The route we took along the western foot of these hills had, so far as we knew, never before been travelled by a European. The few who had visited this region in the past had kept well to the east. 9 days out of Loyongaleni, we camped at the northern end of the hills. By now our supplies were running low, and it was time to turn back. As it turned out, the first part of the safari was luxury compared to the second, because we had had plenty of water from the lake. Now, instead of retracing our steps, we decided to take an inland route. Goite, our Turkana guide, did not seem very sure of the way, and what was worse, was not certain whether we should find water when needed. The region was dependent on water-holes, which at this dry season were few and far between. George, however, calculated that we should never be more than a long day's march from the lake, so, if pressed for water, could make for it. We missed the cooling breeze off the lake, and there were times when I felt nearly dehydrated by the heat. The country here was even more desolate than the one we'd passed through on our outward march. There was nothing but lava, so, understandably, there was little game and no population. Luckily, we'd bought sheep at Loyongaleni, and though Elsa's living larder was rapidly dwindling away, it was sufficient to solve her feeding problem. But most of us lost most of our surplus weight during this time. Our march back was rapid because the donkeys were now carrying less weight, and much of the route being waterless, we had to do longer marches. When, after 18 days, we got back to Loyongaleni, we found that the scouts we'd left behind to protect our base had not been idle. They produced 4 Turkana poachers who'd been caught trapping game. The oldest greeted George with great affection, and reminded him that some 10 years ago he had caught him committing the same offence and sent him to jail at Marsabit. He said that he'd quite enjoyed his enforced stay there, but he did not wish to repeat it. Owing to his age, George relented, and, unofficially, sentenced him to be donkey driver for the rest of the safari. From Loyongaleni, the men went to North Hor, where there were 3 Somali shops, to buy food for the Africans. At the police station, George learned from the African inspector in charge that a gang of 8 mounted poachers, armed with rifles, had been seen between Loyongaleni and North Hor. These poachers are usually Boran tribesmen from across the border. Mounted on ponies which have been trained to go without water for 4 or even 5 days, and often armed with rifles, they ride down and shoot giraffe. They are harboured by their compatriots on our side of the border, who give them prompt warning of approaching patrols. However, in this case, a camel patrol had followed the raiders' tracks for several days, finally surprised them, wounded 1 man and captured 7 ponies. We spent 3 days at Loyongaleni, refitting, mending saddlery, and so on, in preparation for the second part of our safari, the ascent of Mount Kulal. This mountain, which lies 20 miles east of the lake, rises out of the surrounding desert to about 7,500 feet. It catches all the moisture from the monsoon on its upper levels and has developed rich forest on its summit. It is a narrow volcano, 28 miles long, with a crater in the center about 4 miles wide. The object of this part of the safari was to find out whether the game on the mountain was holding its own or decreasing as a result of poaching, by comparing the present situation with that found by George when, 12 years previously, he'd last visited the area. In particular, we wanted to investigate the state of the greater kudu. Kulal does not look impressive from below. It is a long mountain with broad ridges leading to its summit. As we were to discover, these ridges become so narrow that the approaches for pack animals are very limited. The first day's march, over thickly strewn lava boulders, was extremely arduous for laden animals. Later, the ascent up knife-edged ridges was in many places very difficult to negotiate, and we found it necessary to offload the donkeys and manhandle the loads. On the second night, we were 2/3 of the way up the mountain and camped in a precipitous valley choked with lava boulders near a little spring which provided just sufficient water for 1 animal at a time. It was very late before the last donkey had its much-needed drink. This was one of the few water-holes on Kulal, and so it was naturally a vital centre for the Samburu tribesmen who bring their livestock up to Kulal in the dry season. It must have been very difficult for Elsa to meet these large herds of camels, cattle, goats, and sheep around this and other water-holes. But she was intelligent and good-natured, and apparently realizing what the situation was, she put up with the tantalizing smell of these animals which often passed within a few feet of her. On these occasions we put her on the chain, but she made no attempt to attack, and only wanted to get away from the dust and the noise. The route up Kulal was steep, and the climate became arctic as we reached the higher slopes. We walked over ridges, crossed deep ravines, and struggled along precipices. Here the bush was lower, and then it changed into beautiful alpine flora. Next morning we reached the top of Kulal. It was a relief to be walking on more or less even ground. Camp was pitched in a beautiful little glade, close to a rather muddy spring, fouled by the cattle of the Samburu tribesmen. Their astonishment was great at finding a nearly fully grown lion in our camp. In the dense forest belt near the top on most mornings there was heavy mist, so we made a blazing cedar log fire to keep us warm. At night it was so cold that I kept Elsa in my small tent, made her a nest of lichen, and covered her with my warmest blanket. Most of my night was usually spent replacing it, as it fell off continually, and Elsa would begin to shiver. When I did this, she always licked my arm. She never made any attempt to tear the tent and get out. On the contrary, she remained in it long after her usual waking hour, snuggling in her nest where she was warm and cosy, whereas outside there was a blasting gale and wet mist. But as soon as the sun had cleared the fog away, she came to life and enjoyed the invigorating mountain air. Indeed, she loved the place, for the ground was soft and cool. The forest gave thick shade, and there were plenty of buffalo droppings to roll in. Because of the shade and altitude, walking during the heat of the day was no effort in this region, and she was able to explore the mountain with us. One day we stood on the lip of the crater which divides the mountain, and looked across to the northern part, which was not more than 4 miles distant, though we knew that it would take us a full 2 days' march to get there. Nonchalantly, Elsa balanced herself on the edge of the 2,000-foot precipice, a sight which nearly sent me into hysterics. But animals seem to have no fear of heights. The following day we descended, and the safari reached the mouth of the great Ilsigata Gorge. There we made camp. From Ilsigata it was a day and a half's march to the top of the northern massif, which we found to be more thickly inhabited by the Samburu and their livestock than the southern part, so Elsa's liberty had here to be curtailed. We saw little game. George considered that this was probably due to the great number of Samburu stock which were eating up the grazing and rapidly denuding the mountain. Owing to sharp, broken lava, the descent to Loyongaleni was a most exhausting struggle, and not even the superb view of Lake Rudolph far below, reflecting the setting sun in its lead-coloured surface against deep indigo hills and an orange-yellow sky, could compensate us for our tumbles, which grew more and more frequent. Elsa kept looking back at the mountain and the cool forest, and started to run towards them, so we had to put her on the chain. Towards nightfall we lost our way in the dark. Elsa lay down every few yards, making it very plain that she'd had enough. Although she was nearly full-grown, she still liked to suck my thumb when she felt nervous, and there was a lot of thumb-sucking that night. At last, some tracer bullets, fired by the advance party, guided us to the camp. When we staggered in after our nightmare march, Elsa refused food and only wanted to be near me. I also could not eat from exhaustion, and could well imagine the effort it had cost Elsa to carry on. She, of course, could not know why we were doing such a senseless thing as to struggle across sharp lava at night, and it was only her affection for us and her trust that kept her going. In spite of the hardships she had endured on the safari, in the course of which she'd walked well over 300 miles, the bond between us had only been strengthened. As long as she was with us, and knew herself to be loved and secure, she was happy. To feel that we were responsible for such a proud, intelligent animal, who had no other living creature to satisfy her strongly developed need for affection and her gregarious instincts, attached us all the more deeply to her. Sometimes, it's true, she was unwittingly a nuisance. For instance, because we could not leave her in charge of anyone else, we became to some extent her prisoners. But she gave us so much in return for these small sacrifices. The difference between her reactions and ours came only from her natural characteristics intended to be developed and used in the normal life of a wild lion. It was very touching to watch her trying to control the strong forces within her, and to adapt herself to our way of life in order to please us. Her good-natured temperament was certainly due in part to her character, but part too may have come from the fact that neither force nor frustration was ever used to adapt her to our way of life. We tried, by kindness alone, to help her to overcome the differences that lie between our two worlds. In natural life, as he finds food, a lion does not wander over great distances, and certainly Elsa had seen more of the world than she would have done living with a pride. Yet she knew her home, and whenever we returned from safari, she would go straight back to her habits and usual routine. Soon after our return from Lake Rudolph, when we took Elsa out for her evening walks, she began to display a growing restlessness. Sometimes she refused to return with us, and she spent the night out in the bush. Usually we succeeded in getting her back by going to fetch her in the Land Rover. In fact, she soon decided that it was a waste of energy to walk home when a car had been specially brought to fetch her. So she would jump onto the canvas roof and loll at her ease, and from this vantage point she could watch out for game as we drove along. This was a very satisfactory arrangement from her point of view, but unfortunately the manufacturers had not designed the roof as a couch for a lioness. As a result, the supports began to give way under the strain, and we found Elsa gradually subsiding on top of us, so George had to rig up extra supports and reinforce the canvas. Elsa was now 23 months old, and her voice broke to a deep growl. A month later she seemed to be in season, and placed her jets on many bushes, no doubt as an invitation to a mate. Normally she followed us on our walks wherever we went, but now for 2 days she'd seemed determined to cross the valley. On one particular afternoon she led us in her direction, and we soon found the fresh pug marks of a lion. At dark she refused to return. As we were near a car track, we went back to get the Land Rover, and George set off in it while I stayed at home, in case she took a shortcut back. When he reached the place where we'd left her, George shouted to her for some time, but there was no response. Only the hills echoed his calls. He drove on for another mile, calling at intervals. Then, hoping that Elsa had already come home, he returned. I told him I'd waited for 2 long hours, but that there was still no sign of her. So he left again, and some time after he'd gone, I heard a shot. Until he came back, I was very anxious, and then most upset by what he had to tell me. He'd driven out and called for a good half-hour, but Elsa had not shown up. Then he'd stopped the car in an opening in the bush, wondering where to look next. Suddenly, some 200 yards behind the car, there had been a great uproar of lions quarrelling. Then, the next moment, a lioness flashed by with another in hot pursuit. As they shot past, George seized his rifle and put a bullet under the second animal, assuming, probably rightly, that she was a jealous lioness bent on Elsa's destruction. Then he jumped into the car and gave chase. He drove along a narrow lane between dense thorn bush, flashing a spotlight from side to side, until he was brought up short by a lion and 2 lionesses, who only very reluctantly moved out of his way, giving vent to loud roars. He had then come to fetch me, and we now drove back together to the scene. But though we called desperately for Elsa, no familiar sound came in answer. But presently, as if in derision, the lion chorus started up a few 100 yards away. We drove towards them until we could see the glint of 3 pairs of eyes. There was nothing more to be done, so with heavy hearts we turned for home. Had Elsa been killed by a jealous lioness? In her present condition she might easily have mated with the lion, and it was a question whether his lioness would tolerate a rival. However, to our great relief, we'd not gone more than a mile along the track when we came upon Elsa, sniffing at a bush. She utterly ignored us. We tried to persuade her to join us, but she remained where we'd found her, gazing wistfully into the bush, in the direction in which the lions had last been heard. Presently they started calling again, and approached nearer. 30 yards behind us was a dry riverbed, and here the pride stopped, growling vigorously. It was now well after midnight. Elsa sat in the moonlight between the lions and us. Both parties called her to their side. Who was going to win the contest? Suddenly Elsa moved towards the lions, and I shouted, "Elsa, no! Don't go there, you'll get killed!" She sat down again, looking at us and looking back at her own kind, undecided what to do. For an hour the situation did not alter. Then George fired 2 shots over the lions. This had the effect of sending them off in silence. Then, as Elsa had still not made up her mind, we drove slowly back, hoping that she might follow us. And so she did. Very reluctantly, she walked parallel with the car, looking back many times, till finally she hopped onto the roof, and we brought her back to safety. When we arrived home, she was very thirsty and exhausted, and drank without stopping. What had happened during the 5 hours which Elsa had spent with the lions? Would a wild pride accept her, in spite of the human smell which she carried? Would a male ignore a female in season? Why had she returned with us instead of joining her own kind? Was it because she was frightened of the fierce lioness? These were some of the questions we asked ourselves. The fact remained that she'd come to no harm as a result of this experience. But after this adventure, the call of the wild evidently grew stronger and stronger. Often she did not return with us at dark, and we spent many evenings looking for her. In the dry season, water was our main hold on her, for this she could only get at the house. Rocks were her favourite places, and she always chose the top of a cliff or some other safe position as her lookout. Once, in spite of hearing a leopard coughing close by, we had to leave her on such a rock. Next morning she returned with several bleeding scratches, and we wondered whether the leopard was responsible for them. Another time, after sunset, she followed the laughing cries of a hyena. Soon these increased to hysterical shrieks, to which Elsa replied with loud growls. George rushed to see what was happening and was just in time to shoot one of 2 hyenas which were closing in on Elsa. After this she pulled her kill into a bush, dragging it between her front legs, as she had often done with the ground sheet when she was a cub. But although she was now 2 years old, her teeth could not yet penetrate the skin of a hyena, and she did not know what to do with her quarry. She seemed to come into season every 2.5 months. We'd been told that the most obvious indication of this condition was a loud purring. Although she had by now been twice in season, we had never noticed anything of the kind, but each time she had a peculiar smell and sprayed her invitation jets on the bushes. Soon after her adventures with the lions, Nuru reported that when in the morning he tried to follow her, Elsa had growled at him repeatedly. Obviously she wished him to remain behind, while she walked determinedly into the hills. So in spite of the increasing heat, she trotted off quickly until he lost her tracks in the rocks. In the afternoon we followed her spoor, but soon lost it, and could only call to her from the foot of the cliffs. A reply came, a strange growl, unlike Elsa's voice, but undoubtedly that of a lion. Soon afterwards we saw her struggling downhill over the boulders, calling in her familiar way. When she reached us, she flung herself exhausted onto the ground, panting and very excited. We had brought water with us, and she could not have enough of it. Now we noticed several bleeding claw marks on her hind legs, shoulders and neck, and also 2 bleeding perforations on her forehead, which were definitely made by teeth and not by claws. Is it a coincidence that when 2 years later I visited the Rome Zoo, I saw a couple of lions mating, and as the last gesture of the siring act, the male bit the lioness on the forehead? Although normally Elsa had no personal smell, she now certainly had a very strong one, much stronger than her present seasonal smell. As soon as she had recovered a little, she greeted us in her customary manner, as well as purring at each of us in turn in a most startling way, as though to say, "Listen to what I have learned." When she had assured herself of our admiration, she threw herself on the ground again and fell fast asleep for 2 hours. She had obviously just been with a lion when we had interfered by calling to her. From this time onwards, Elsa spent more and more nights away. We tried to induce her to come home by driving near to her favourite places and calling to her. Occasionally she came, more often she did not. Sometimes she was away without food or water for 2 or 3 days. Water was still some hold over her, but soon the rains were due, and we realized that when they came, we should lose all control of her. This raised a problem which we had to solve. It was one which was made more urgent by the fact that our long overseas leave was due in May. Elsa was now 27 months old, almost full-grown. We had always known that we could not keep her free indefinitely at Isiolo. Our original idea had been to send her to join her sisters at the Rotterdam Zoo, and we had even made the necessary arrangements in case an emergency should arise. But now she had decided her future for herself, and her latest developments were decisive in altering our plans for her. Because we'd been so fortunate in bringing her up in her natural environment, and because she seemed so much at home in the bush and was accepted by wild animals, we felt that she might well prove to be the exception to the rule that a pet will be killed by its own kind because of its human smell and ignorance of bush life. To release Elsa back to the wild would be an experiment well worth trying. We intended to spend 2 or 3 weeks with her. Then, if all went well, we would take our long leave. This one is supposed to be spent outside Kenya in order to have a change of climate. Next, we had to consider where to release Elsa. Unfortunately, Isiolo was far too populated for us to let her go wild there, but we knew of an area which for most of the year was devoid of inhabitants and livestock, but had an abundance of game, especially lion. We received permission to take Elsa to this place, and so we made the necessary arrangements. The rains were expected any day, so we had no time to lose if she were to reach her possible future home before they began. We had decided to travel by night, and when the evening of our departure arrived, it was after midnight by the time we'd secured Elsa in her travelling crate. In the hope of making the trip easier for her, I'd given her a tranquilizer. We'd been told by the vet that the drug was harmless and that the effect would last about 8 hours. To give Elsa all the moral support I could, I travelled with her in the open lorry. Owing to the effect of the tranquilizer, she was only semi-conscious, yet even in this state, every few minutes she stretched her paws out through the bars of the crate to assure herself that I was still there. It took us 17 hours to reach our destination. The effects of the tranquilizer did not wear off until an hour after we'd arrived. During these 18 hours, Elsa became very cold and her breathing slowed. For a time I feared that she was going to die. Luckily, she recovered, but this experience showed us that one should be very careful with drugs where lions are concerned, for they're far more sensitive to them than other animals, and individually they react differently. It was late in the afternoon by the time we reached our destination. There we were met by a friend who was the game warden of this district. We pitched camp on a superb site at the base of a 1,000-foot escarpment, overlooking a vast plain of open bush country, through which a belt of dark vegetation marks the course of a river. As we were at an altitude of 5,000 feet, the air was fresh and brisk. Immediately in front of our camp lay open grassland sloping towards the plain, on which herds of Thomson's gazelle, topee, wildebeest, Burchell's zebra, roan antelope, congoni, and a few buffalo were grazing. It was a game paradise. While the tents were being pitched, we took Elsa for a stroll, and she rushed at the herds, not knowing which to follow, for in every direction there were animals running. As if to shake off the effects of the ghastly journey, Elsa lost herself among these new playmates, who were rather astonished to find such a strange lion in their midst, one who rushed foolishly to and fro without any apparent purpose. Soon, however, Elsa had had enough, and trotted back to camp and her dinner. Our plan was this. We would spend the first week taking Elsa, perched on the roof of the Land Rover, round the new country, thus getting her used to it and to the numerous animals, many of which belong to species which do not live in the northern frontier, and which she'd therefore never seen. During the second week, we intended to leave her overnight while she was active in the bush. We would visit and feed her in the mornings when she was sleepy. Afterwards, we would reduce her meals in the hope that this would encourage her to kill on her own or to join a wild lion. On the morning after our arrival, we started our program. First, we took off her collar, as the symbol of liberation. Elsa hopped onto the roof of the Land Rover, and we went off. After only a few hundred yards, we saw a lioness walking parallel to us downhill. She passed close to many antelope who took no notice of her, realizing, no doubt from her determined, steady stride, that at the moment she was not interested in killing. We drove closer to the lioness. Elsa displayed much excitement, jumped off her seat, and making low moaning noises, cautiously followed this new friend. But as soon as the lioness stopped and turned round, her courage failed her, and she raced back as fast as she could to the safety of the car. The lioness continued her purposeful walk, and we soon detected 6 cubs waiting for her on a small anthill in tall grass. We drove on and passed through herd after herd of different antelope. All the time Elsa watched carefully, but did not attempt to leave the car unless she spotted an animal off guard, grazing with its back towards her. Then she would get down quietly and creep forward with her belly close to the ground, taking advantage of every bit of cover, and thus advance towards her victim. But as soon as the animal showed any suspicion, she either froze to immobility or, if the situation seemed better handled in another way, she pretended to be uninterested, licked her paws, yawned, or even rolled on her back until the animal was reassured. Then she would at once start stalking again. But however cunning she was, she never got close enough to kill. One morning we followed circling vultures, and soon found a lion on a zebra kill. He was tearing at the meat and paid no attention to us. Elsa stepped cautiously from the car, meowing at him, and then, though she did not get any encouragement, advanced carefully towards him. At last the lion looked up and straight at her. He seemed to say, "Don't you know lion etiquette? How dare you interfere with the lord while he's having his meal? You were allowed to kill for me, but afterwards you have to wait till I've had my share. Then you may finish up the remains." Evidently poor Elsa did not like this expression, and returned as fast as she could to the safety of the car. The lord continued feeding, and we watched him for a long time, hoping that Elsa might regain her courage, but nothing would induce her to leave her safe position. Next morning we had better luck. We saw a topi standing like a sentry on an anthill, looking intently in one direction. We followed his glance and discovered a young lion resting in the high grass, sunning himself. He was a magnificent young male with a beautiful blonde mane, and Elsa seemed attracted to him. Just the right husband for her, we thought. We drove to within 30 yards of him. The lion looked mildly surprised when he saw his prospective bride sitting on top of a car, but responded in a friendly manner. Elsa, apparently overcome by coyness, made low moans but would not come off the roof, so we drove a little distance away and persuaded her to get down. Then suddenly we left her and drove round to the other side of the lion. This meant that she would have to pass him in order to reach us. After much painful hesitation, she plucked up enough courage to walk towards the lion. When she was about 10 paces away from him, she lay down with her ears back and her tail swishing. The lion got up and went towards her with, I'm sure, the friendliest intentions, but at the last moment Elsa panicked and rushed back to the car. We drove away with her, and strangely enough, right into a pride of 2 lions and 1 lioness on a kill. This was luck indeed. They must have killed very recently, for they were so intent upon their meal that however much Elsa talked to them, they paid not the slightest attention to her. Finally they left the kill, their bulging stomachs swinging from side to side. Elsa lost no time in inspecting the remains of the carcass, her first contact with a real kill. Nothing could have served our purpose better than this meal, provided by lions and full of their fresh scent. After Elsa had had her fair share, we dragged the kill back to the handsome young lion who'd seemed so friendly. We hoped that if Elsa provided him with a meal, he would have a favourable opinion of her. Then we left her and the kill near to him and drove away. After a few hours we set out to see what had happened, but met Elsa already halfway back to the camp. However, since this lion had shown an interest in her, we took her back to him during the afternoon. We found him still in the same place. Elsa talked to him from her couch as though they were old friends, but had plainly no intention of leaving the car. To induce her to quit her seat, we drove behind a bush and I got out, but was nearly knocked over by a hyena who dashed out of his cool retreat, in which we then found a newly killed baby zebra, no doubt provided by the blonde lion. It was Elsa's feeding time, so regardless of the consequences, she jumped out of the car onto the carcass. We took this opportunity to drive away as fast as we could and left her alone for her night's adventure. Early next morning, anxious to know the outcome of the experiment, we set off to visit her, hoping to find a happy pair. What we found was poor Elsa, waiting at the spot at which we'd left her, but minus the lion and minus the kill. She was overjoyed to see us, desperate to stay with us, and sucked my thumbs frantically to make sure that everything was all right between us. I was very unhappy that I'd hurt her feelings, without being able to explain to her that all we'd done was intended to be for her good. When she had calmed down, and even felt safe enough in our company to fall asleep, we decided, rather sadly, that we must break faith with her again, and we sneaked away. Till now we'd always given her her meat already cut up, so that she would not associate her food with living animals. Now we needed to reverse our system, so during her midday sleep we drove 60 miles to shoot a small buck for her. We had to go this distance because no one was allowed to shoot game near the camp. We brought her a complete buck, wondering if she would know how to open it, since she'd had no mother to teach her the proper way of doing it. We soon saw that by instinct she knew exactly what to do. She started at the inner part of the hind legs, where the skin is softest, then tore out the guts, and after enjoying these delicacies, buried the stomach contents and covered up the blood spoor, as all proper lion do. Then she gnawed the meat off the bones with her molars and rasped it away with her rough tongue. Once we knew that she could do this, it was time for us to let her do her own killing. The plain was covered with isolated bush clusters, ideal hideouts for any animal. All the lions had to do, when they wanted a meal, was to wait under cover until an antelope approached downwind, rush out and get their dinner. We now left Elsa alone for 2 or 3 days at a time, hoping that hunger would make her kill. But when we came back, we always found her waiting for us and hungry. It was heartbreaking having to stick to our program, when obviously all she wanted was to be with us and sure of our affection. By now we realized that it was going to take us much longer to release her to nature than we'd expected. We therefore asked the government if we could use our long leave in the country for the purpose of carrying out this experiment, and very kindly they consented. After receiving this permission, we felt much relieved, since we knew that we should now have the time required for our task. We increased the number of days on which Elsa was left on her own, and we reinforced the thorn fences round our tents so that they were strong enough to keep any lion out. This we did specifically to prevent Elsa from visiting us when she was hungry. One morning, when she was with us, we located a lion who seemed placid and in a good mood. Elsa stepped off the car, and we tactfully left the pair alone. That evening, while sitting in our thorn-protected tent, we suddenly heard Elsa's meow, and before we could stop her, she crept through the thorns and settled down with us. She was bleeding from claw marks, and had walked 8 miles back, obviously preferring our company to that of the lion. The next time we took her a longer distance away from camp. Soon we met 2 young lions sitting on the grass in the open. They looked to us ideal companions for Elsa, but by now she was very suspicious of our tricks and would not leave the car, although she talked very agitatedly to them. As we had no means of dropping her off, we had to miss this opportunity, and went on until we met 2 Thompson's gazelles, fighting. This sight caused Elsa to jump off, and we drove quickly away, leaving her to learn more about wildlife. It was nearly a week before we returned. We found her waiting, and very hungry. She was full of affection. We had deceived her so often, broken faith with her, done so much to destroy her trust in us, yet she remained loyal. We dropped some meat which we'd brought with us, and she immediately started to eat it. Suddenly we heard unmistakable growls, and soon saw 2 lions trotting fast towards us. They were obviously on the hunt, and probably they'd scented the meat. They approached very quickly. Poor Elsa took in the situation and bolted as hurriedly as she could, leaving her precious meal. She watched from a distance and saw her first meal after so many days being taken away from her. In the circumstances, it seemed hard that the two lions took no interest in anything but their food and completely ignored her. To compensate her for her disappointment, we took her away. We had now been in camp for 4 weeks, and although Elsa had spent most of the last fortnight in the bush, she had not yet started killing for herself. She had become so suspicious of being deserted again that we had great difficulty in inducing her to follow us into the plains. One morning, however, she did accompany us, and almost immediately we met 2 lionesses who came hurriedly towards the car, but Elsa bolted from them and seemed more nervous than ever. It was evident that in this place she was scared of lions, so we decided not to go on trying to force her to make friends with them, but to wait till she came into season again. Then perhaps she would choose her own mate by mutual attraction. Meanwhile, we would concentrate our efforts on training her to kill her food, and thus become independent of us. Also, once she could kill, she would be a more suitable partner for a lion, should she decide to join one. The plains were now largely under water, the rains having started, and most of the game had concentrated on the few bits of slightly higher ground which were drier. Elsa loved one little hillock, which was studded with rocks, and we therefore chose this place as her experimental headquarters. It was, unfortunately, only 8 miles from our camp. It would have been better if we could have moved off to a greater distance, but under the existing weather conditions, this was not practicable. We left Elsa for a week on her hillock, but when we returned she looked so unhappy that it needed all my willpower to harden myself sufficiently to carry on with her education. We sat with her during the midday lull until she dozed off, with her head on my lap. Suddenly, in the bush just behind us, there was a frightening crash, and a rhino appeared. We both jumped up like lightning, and while I ran behind a tree, Elsa gallantly charged the intruder and drove it away. Most unfairly, during her absence, we deserted her again. Late that afternoon, the atmosphere became heavy with moisture, and the setting sun was spectacularly reflected against dark red curtains of cloud hanging out of a grey sky, pierced by fragments of parallel rainbows. Then a few heavy drops fell like lead to the ground, and a deluge descended with such torrential force that soon our camp was in the middle of a running stream. For hours the flood continued. I imagined poor Elsa alone in this icy night, drenched, shivering, and miserable. Thunder and lightning added to my nightmare. Next morning we waded the 8 miles to the ridge where we'd left her. As usual, she was waiting for us, overjoyed to see us, and greeted us each in turn by rubbing her head and body against us repeatedly, uttering her moaning noise. But today there was no doubt that she was miserable. Indeed, she was nearly crying. We decided that though it would interrupt her education, we could not leave her out in such weather. Unlike the local lions used to this climate, she came from semi-desert country and could not quickly adapt herself to very different conditions. Now she was pleased to walk back with us, splashing in her familiar Isiolo way through the swamp and showing how happy she was. Next day she was ill. When she moved, she was in great pain. Her glands were swollen and she had a temperature. We made her a bed of grass in the annex to George's tent, and there she lay, panting, listless and pathetic. I treated her with M&B, the only drug which I thought might help. She wanted me to be near her all the time, which of course I was. The rains had now set in. Even a car with a 4-wheel drive could not plough through to the nearest place at which blood-slides could be tested, so we sent a runner the 100-odd miles with various samples. The reply when it came stated that Elsa was infested with hookworm and tapeworm, from both of which she had previously suffered and which we knew how to treat. But neither of these troubles could account for her swollen glands or her temperature. We believed that she had also become infected by some tick-borne virus. If this proved true, it would suggest that an animal, immune to diseases in its own environment, when transferred to another, does not carry the same immunity to local strains, and might be one explanation for the often puzzling distribution of animals found in East Africa. Poor Elsa became so very ill that for a time we did not think she would recover at all. However, after a week or so, the fever became intermittent, and every 3 or 4 days her temperature would rise and then go back to normal. She was rapidly losing her beautiful golden color. Her coat was dull, like cotton wool, and she developed many white hairs on her back. Her face became ash-gray. She had difficulty in dragging herself from the tent into the sparse sunshine, and the only hopeful sign was her appetite. During her illness, because she lived so intimately with us, Elsa became more dependent on us and tamer than ever. Most of the day she lay across the entrance to our thorn fence enclosure in a strategic position, which enabled her to watch all that went on inside the camp and outside on the plain as well. We gave her as much meat and milk as she wanted, although both had to be fetched from a long distance. We also succeeded, in spite of the transport difficulties arising from the weather, in corresponding regularly with the veterinary laboratory in Nairobi, but as no sign of a parasite was found in the samples we provided, we had to treat her more or less by guesswork. We dosed her for hookworm and for rickettsia, a tick-borne parasite, which had been suggested as a possible cause of her illness. She was very gentle and responsive to all we did for her, and often hugged me with her paws when I rested my head on her shoulders. It was now 5 weeks since her illness had started, and her condition had only improved slightly. It was plain that the climate in this region was against her, and also that she might not be immune from local infections, such as ticks and tsetse, which vary according to localities. Besides this, she was different in appearance from the local lions, much darker in colour, with a longer nose, bigger ears, and generally much smaller. In every way she belonged to the semi-desert, and not to the highlands. Finally, being in a game reserve meant that not only did George have to go 20 miles by car to get outside the reserve to shoot meat for her, but also that he could not take her hunting with him, and thereby give her the opportunity of being in at the kill, and getting the feel of pulling down a live animal, an experience which, in her wild state, she would have gained from her mother. It was evident, therefore, that after having camped here for 3 months, we must try to choose a better home for her. It was not easy to find an area which had a suitable climate, permanent water, enough game to supply her with food, and no tribesmen or hunting parties. Moreover, it needed to be accessible by car. Eventually we discovered such a paradise, and received the government's permission to release a lion there. As soon as the rain ceased, we decided to go there. Thus ended the first 3 months of our experiment. We'd failed this time owing to Elsa's illness, but felt confident that given time and patience, we would succeed. The area we'd chosen for our second attempt was quite different from the region we'd tried first. It was much hotter, and there were no great herds of game grazing peacefully on grassy plains. Only thornbush, with visibility reduced to a few yards, a hunter's nightmare. But it was only 35 miles from Elsa's birthplace, and was the type of country that was natural to her. When we left the lush tropical greenery which was confined to the river banks, we felt the intense heat of the sun hitting us like a hot wave. We were within a short distance of the equator, and our altimeter read 1,600 feet. The dense, dry thorn bush was only penetrable by a network of game paths. These were also useful in warning us of elephant, rhino, and buffalo, whose spoor and droppings left no doubt that the paths were in daily use. About 200 yards from the camp there was a salt lick, and many impressions of rhino horns and elephant tusks in the salt told us that they were frequent visitors to it. Also, nearly every tree of any size had its bark polished or worn off by elephants rubbing their bodies against it. Because of this, Elsa found it difficult to do her daily claw exercises, as there were few trees left with any rough bark. The great attraction of the place was a huge ridge of reddish rock with cliffs and caves, in whose shadows we saw hyrax dashing about. It was an ideal lion's home with a splendid lookout. From its top we watched giraffe, waterbuck, lesser kudu and bushbuck moving towards the river, which was their life artery in this otherwise waterless, semi-desert country. Either as a result of our rickettsia treatment or owing to the change in climate, Elsa's condition improved daily, so we were able to restart her education. Every morning, as soon as it got light, we took Elsa for a walk, and did so again in the afternoon. These walks, which took us along the numerous game paths and sandy watercourses, were full of interest. Elsa loved them. She sniffed and followed the spoor of animals which had been there during the previous night, and chased warthog and dik-dik. We too were on the alert, taking note of animal tracks, their freshness and direction, which way the wind was blowing, and kept ears and eyes open for telltale sounds and sights. This was necessary because otherwise one was apt to run unexpectedly into rhino, buffalo, or elephant, and it is these surprise meetings at close quarters which can lead to trouble. Here, unlike the first place to which we'd taken her, Elsa was able to go out hunting with George. We both hate killing animals, but now we had to make some sacrifices to Elsa's education, and the knowledge that in her natural state she would have been killing them on her own account appeased our qualms. The sooner she learned to do it properly, the better for all concerned. For the present, she must stalk her quarry. Then, if she were not able to kill, George would bring the animal down with a bullet and leave her to give the coup de grace. After this, she would be left to protect her kill against vultures, hyenas, and lions, and in this way would meet these animals in natural circumstances. One evening, Elsa did not come back from her favourite lookout on top of the rocks. It was a splendid place where she found the breeze cool, where no tsetse fly molested her, and from which she could watch the animals below. But as we had only been a short time in the area, we were worried at her absence and went out to look for her. By then it was well after dark. The bush was alive with dangerous animals, and we found creeping through the dense scrub nerve-wracking. There was no sign of Elsa, so, defeated, we returned. At dawn we resumed our search, and soon found her pug marks mixed up with those of a large lion. The spoors led down to the river and reappeared on the far side. Here there were outcrops of rock, and we thought that perhaps the lion had his domain there and had taken Elsa to his lay-up. About lunchtime, a wild chatter started up among the baboons near the camp. We hoped that this might herald Elsa's return, and sure enough, she soon came swimming across the river. She greeted us, rubbing her head against us in turn and talking to us excitedly about her adventure. We were glad not to find any scratches on her. Since it was only a fortnight since she'd been badly treated by a lion when we were still at our former camp, we hoped that the fact that her new escapade had been voluntary was a good augury for her release. One morning, a waterbuck offered an excellent opportunity for initiating Elsa into killing. George shot it, but before it fell, Elsa jumped at its throat and hung on like a bulldog, until in a few minutes the animal died of suffocation. It was her first experience of killing a large animal of about her own weight. We now saw that she knew the vital spot by instinct, and also the way of effecting a quick death. In fact, she'd made use of a lion's normal method of killing a prey, which is not, as some people imagine, by breaking its neck. She first ate the tail, and this, as we were to discover, became her normal practice. Then she opened the animal between the hind legs, ate the guts, and carefully buried the stomach, covering up all traces of blood. Might this be a way of deceiving the vultures? Then she seized the buck by the neck, and straddling it between her forepaws, dragged it into a strategically well-chosen spot, in this case a shady thicket some 50 yards away. We left her there to guard her kill by day from vultures, and after dark from hyena. About tea-time we went back to visit her, and brought her water. Although she loved her afternoon walk with us, this time she made no attempt to leave her kill. When it became dark, she did not return, but about 3 a.m. we were awakened by a heavy cloudburst, and soon after this she appeared and spent the rest of the night in camp. Early in the morning we all went out to see what had happened to her kill. Of course, it had disappeared, and the ground was patterned with lion and hyena spoor. Nearby we heard some lion grunts. These made us wonder whether it was the rain or the lions which had made Elsa leave her kill during the night. Close to the river stood a magnificent tree, its branches nearly sweeping the water. Under its green canopy, protected by its cool shade and subdued light from the glaring sun, I felt as though I were under a dome. Here, concealed by the low branches, I watched many wild creatures which came to the river to drink. Sitting there with Elsa close to me, I felt as though I were on the doorstep of paradise, man and beast in trusting harmony, the slow-flowing river adding to the idyll. I thought that this place would make a stimulating studio for me to paint or write in, so we nailed some chop boxes across a wooden frame and improvised a table and bench, and soon I began to work there, leaning against the broad trunk of the tree. Standing on her hind legs, Elsa inspected my paint box and typewriter suspiciously, and resting both her front paws on the unfortunate tools, she licked my face and wanted to be assured of my affection before I was allowed to start work. Then she settled down at my feet, and I began, full of inspiration, but I had not reckoned with our audience. As soon as I tried to concentrate, I heard the inquiring bark of a baboon peeping through the foliage. Then the bush on the opposite bank became alive with inquisitive, watching faces. Soon, intrigued by Elsa, they came more and more into the open, swinging recklessly from tree to tree, screaming and barking, sliding backwards down the trunks or hopping and swaying like shadows in the treetops, until one little chap fell with a splash into the river. At once an old baboon came to its rescue and, clutching the wet, struggling creature, raced off with it to safety. At this, all the baboons in the world seemed to have got loose, and the screeching was deafening. Elsa, who could tolerate the noise no longer, plunged into the river and swam across, accompanied by the hilarious shrieks of the baboons. As soon as she'd reached firm ground, she jumped at the nearest of the little tormentors. He swung tantalizingly low, but nimbly avoided a spanking by hopping to a higher branch, from which place of safety he pulled faces and shook the branch at Elsa. The others joined in the game, and the more infuriated Elsa became, the more they enjoyed teasing her. They sat just out of her reach, scratching their posteriors, pretending to be utterly unaware of the raging lioness just below. The scene was so funny that, in spite of Elsa's humiliation, I opened my cine camera and filmed it. This was too much for her. As soon as she saw me focusing the hated box on her, she splashed back through the river, and before I had time to secure the camera, she leapt on me, and we both rolled over in the sand with the precious Bolex. Everything was wet. The baboons applauded our performance enthusiastically, and I fear that in the eyes of our audience, both Elsa and I lost face very considerably. After this, the baboons looked every day for Elsa, and both sides got to know each other very well. As she tolerated their provocations and took to ignoring them, they grew bolder and bolder. Often they squatted for their daily drinks at the edge of the rapids, separated from her by only a few yards of water. One would keep sentry duty, while the others sat on their haunches and, bending low, slowly drank their fill. Our idyll would have been perfect if Elsa had not been a carnivore which had to be trained to kill. Our next victim was a gerenuk. After Elsa had done her share in the killing, we left her some miles away from our camp in charge of the carcass. On our way home we saw a lion walking in her direction. Had he already scented the kill? When in the afternoon we went to visit Elsa, she as well as the kill had gone, but plenty of big lion spoor told us what had happened. We followed her pug marks for over 2 miles. They led towards her favourite rock, on which, with our field glasses, we eventually detected her. She had been clever enough to choose the only spot where she felt strategically safe from lion, and could also be seen by us from a distance. Every day a buffalo approached our camp, until one morning he became a victim. George shot him. Although he was dead long before Elsa arrived, she went wild with excitement. Indeed, she got far more worked up over this carcass than we'd ever seen her before to kill. She pounced madly on the dead buffalo, attacking him from every side and turning somersaults across the body. But however uncontrolled her movements seemed to be, she took good care to keep out of reach of the deadly horns. Finally, she tapped the buffalo on the nose with her paw to make sure that he was dead. George's main purpose in shooting such a big beast had been to attract wildlion to the kill. We hoped that if they came, Elsa could join in the feast and make friends with them. In order to control whatever might happen, we decided to drag the carcass close to the camp and then leave Elsa in charge of it. Meanwhile, we went off to fetch the car. When we returned, the trees around were weighed down with vultures and marabou storks, but Elsa was keeping them at bay, sitting out in the hot sun next to her kill. She was plainly much relieved when we, her pride, took over and made it possible for her to retire to a shady bush. Good-naturedly, she watched the carcass being fastened to a chain and attached to the car, and while the poor Land Rover jerked across uneven ground, towing the heavy buffalo, she rode, as usual, on the canvas roof, adding another 300 pounds to the load. After the kill had been secured with a chain to a tree close to camp, Elsa guarded it jealously during the whole of the following day and night. Judging by the never-ending chorus of high-pitched chuckles from Hyena, she was kept very busy after dark, but next morning when we returned, she was still protecting the carcass. Only then did she leave it, making it very plain that it was now our turn to be on guard while she trotted away to the river. We covered the kill with thorns as a protection from vultures, and so saved it for another night's defense lesson. Elsa joined us on our usual afternoon's walk, her swaying belly full of buffalo meat. After a short time, through the bush, she spotted a hyena making its way slowly towards the kill. Immediately she froze, her left front paw suspended in the air. Then, with the utmost caution, she lowered herself to a crouching position, blending among the straw-coloured grass till she was almost invisible. Tense with controlled excitement, she watched the hyena hobbling peacefully along, quite unaware that it had an audience. When it came to within a few yards, Elsa rushed forward and gave it a well-aimed smack. With a yell, the animal rolled over and lay on its back, emitting howls and long-drawn moans. Elsa looked at us and jerked her head in her characteristic way towards her victim, as though saying, "What shall we do next?" As she did not get any encouragement from us, she started licking idly at her paws and appeared utterly bored by the miserable creature in front of her. Gradually the hyena pulled itself together and eventually, still whining protests, sneaked away. Elsa's trust in us was shown on other occasions. Late one afternoon, we'd left her in charge of a buck which she and George had killed a long distance from the camp. Knowing that she would not remain with it alone during the night so far away from us, we collected a car to bring it nearer to camp. But on our return, Elsa and the kill had gone. Soon, however, she appeared through the bush and led us to the hideout, to which she had dragged it during our absence. Although she was very pleased to see us, she would not allow us to pull the kill to the car, and all the tricks I tried to make her leave it failed. She was not going to be fooled. Finally, we manoeuvred the car in front of the carcass, and I pointed first to the car and then to the buck, then to the car and again to the buck, trying to make her see that we wanted to help her. She must have understood, for suddenly she got up, rubbed her head against my knees, and pulled her kill from under the thorn bush towards the car. Finally, she tried to lift it by the head into the Land Rover. Soon realizing that she could not do this from outside, she then leapt into the car, and from there, gripping the head, pulled with all her strength while we lifted the hindquarters. When the buck was safely inside, Elsa sat on it, panting, while George drove on. However, she found that bumping through the bush was not at all comfortable in her cramped position, so she jumped out again and onto the roof, bending her head frequently to see if all was well inside and the kill still there. When we arrived at the camp, we had to face the problem of getting the buck out of the car. But now Elsa treated us as her allies and let us do most of the pulling. Everyone was helping except myself, so Elsa walked up to me and gave me an encouraging spank as though to say, "What about you helping too?" Although we had left the kill fairly near the camp, we soon heard her dragging it along with the intention, no doubt, of bringing it inside our tent. We quickly closed the thorn fence, locking her out with her smelly buck. Poor Elsa! It was much safer inside the tent. Now she would have to spend the whole night protecting it. The best thing she could do was to place it against the outside of the thorn fence, and this she did. As a result, the hyenas came so close and made so much noise that sleep was impossible. Finally, Elsa must have got tired of chasing the creatures away, for we heard her dragging the buck towards the river and then splashing through the water with it. This defeated the hyenas, and they left. Did she know that they would not follow her through water? Next morning, we found her spoor and the marks left by dragging the kill. They led across the river, but then it seemed she'd not wanted to be separated from us, and so she dragged it back to our side. Here she had placed it in impenetrable bush, right at the water's edge, so that no animal could get at it unless they approached from the river. We now found her resting with the buck, and she made it obvious that she was very much hurt that we'd locked her out. It took us a long time to win back her confidence and to be forgiven. One morning we walked in a dry riverbed and read the news about last night's visitors in the sand. 2 lion and plenty of elephant were of major importance. The sun was getting hot, and we were all tired after a 3-hour walk. The wind was against us, and coming carelessly round a bend, we nearly collided with a herd of elephant. Luckily, Elsa was trotting a short distance behind us, so we had time to jump onto the high bank while the elephants climbed up the other side and took 3 tiny calves into safety. One old bull stayed in the rear, ready to charge should there be any nonsense. Elsa came sleepily along, then, seeing the bull, sat down. We watched, wondering what would happen. Both sides looked at each other for what seemed to us an endless time. Finally, it was the elephant who gave in and joined his herd, while Elsa rolled on her back, getting rid of some tsetse flies. One day we were very tired, and I was walking along absent-mindedly behind Elsa. Suddenly she gave a terrific grunt, reared up on her hind legs and leapt back. We were passing a tree which forked about 5 feet above the ground, and now I saw a red cobra coiled up in it, erecting its hood towards us. Thanks to Elsa, nothing happened, but to pass a cobra at such close range might have been serious. It was the first time I'd seen one in a tree. Even Elsa was impressed, and during the next few days she made a careful detour whenever we came near to that tree. At this time it was very hot, and Elsa spent much of her time in the river. Often she stood half submerged in the cool water. Although we often saw crocodiles, they never seemed to worry her. Whenever George shot a guinea fowl near the river, Elsa retrieved it from the water and used its rescue as an excuse for prolonged splashings with the bird in her mouth. She enjoyed the game just as much as we loved watching her. She had now completely recovered and was perfectly fit. She was very conservative in her habits, and except for slight variations, our routine was the same every day. An early morning walk, followed by her midday slumber close to me by our tree on the river bank. This lasted until tea time. Then came our afternoon stroll. On our return, she found her meal waiting for her. She usually carried it onto the roof of the Land Rover, where she remained until the lights were put out and everybody went to bed. Then she joined George in his tent, sleeping next to his bed on the ground, a paw always in touch with him. One afternoon, Elsa refused to come for a walk. When we returned after dark, she disappeared and did not return until next morning. Later, we found large lion pug marks close to camp, and when she came back, I again noticed the peculiar smell which was typical of her being in season. Her manners were another indication of this condition. Although she was very friendly, the real affection was missing. Soon after breakfast, she was off again, and kept away all day. After dark, we heard her hopping onto the Land Rover, and I went out at once to play with her. But she was aloof and very restless, jumped down and vanished into the dark. During the night, I heard her splashing in the river, to the accompaniment of agitated noises coming from alarmed baboons. This lasted until early morning. Then Elsa returned for a quick visit to the camp, tolerated George's pattings, purred at him, and went off again. It was obvious that she was in love. We knew now by experience that this period lasted about 4 days. Unlike the conditions in our former camp, everything here was favourable to giving her an opportunity to go back to her natural life. The right moment seemed to have come, so we decided to withdraw tactfully for 1 week and leave her alone. We hoped in the company of a mate. We had to act quickly in order to avoid her seeing our departure. While we were packing, Elsa returned. We therefore arranged that while I looked after her, George would break camp, drive the loaded cars a distance of about 1 mile, and send a message to me to join him when everything was ready. I took Elsa away from the camp to our tree. Would this be the last time we should see it together? She knew something was wrong, and though I tried to keep to our normal routine and had taken the typewriter along and made the familiar tickings to appease her suspicions, she was not reassured, nor could I type properly, for my mind was too upset. Although we had prepared ourselves for this release, and hoped it might give Elsa a happier future than she would have living in captivity, it was a different matter when it came to making the break, and actually to cut through our affection and leave her, possibly never to see her again. Elsa must have felt my emotion, for she rubbed her silky head against me. The river flowed slowly in front of us, as it had flowed yesterday, and as it would flow tomorrow. A hornbill called. Some dry leaves fell off the tree and were carried away by the water. Elsa was part of this life. She belonged to nature, and not to man. We were man, and we loved her, and she'd been brought up to love us. Would she be able to forget all that had been familiar to her until this morning? Would she go and hunt when she was hungry, or would she wait trustfully for our return, knowing that up to now we had never let her down? I had just given her a kiss to reassure her of my affection and to give her a feeling of security. But was it a kiss of betrayal? How could she know that it needed all the strength of my love for her to leave her now and give her back to nature, to let her learn to live alone until she might find her pride, her real pride? Nuru came and called me away. He'd brought some meat along, and Elsa followed him trustfully into the reeds and started to eat. Then we stole away. We drove 10 miles to another river, smaller but much deeper than the one we'd left. Here we intended to spend a week. Late in the afternoon, George and I strolled along the bank. We walked quietly, our thoughts with Elsa. I realized acutely how much I'd become dependent on her, how much I had for nearly 3 years lived the life of a lioness, shared her feelings, interests, and reactions. We had lived so intimately together that being alone seemed unbearable. I felt desperately lonely with no Elsa walking at my side, rubbing her head against me and letting me feel her soft skin and warm body. The sun was sinking, and its warm light was reflected on the shiny fronds of the doom palms, tinting their tops with a golden glow. What a beautiful world Elsa had been born into. Whatever losing her might mean to me, we must now try our utmost to give her back to this life and save her from a captive existence, in which she would be deprived of all that nature intended for her. Although up to now there was no record of a hand-reared lion being successfully liberated, we still hoped that Elsa would be able to adapt herself to wild life, to a life which she had always been very close to. At last, the week of anxiety ended, and we went back to see how Elsa had stood up to the test. When we arrived at our former camp, we looked at once for her pug marks. There was no sign of them. I began to call. Soon afterwards, we heard her familiar growl and saw her coming from the river, trotting as fast as she could. Her welcome showed us that she'd missed us as much as we'd missed her, and her rubbings and meowings touched us deeply. We'd brought her a buck, but she hardly glanced at it and continued her greetings. As soon as the great rejoicings were over, I looked at her stomach. It was full. She must have eaten recently. This took a great load off my mind, for it meant that she was now safe. She had proved that she could fend for herself. She had proved that she could be independent of us, at least so far as food was concerned. While our tents were being pitched, I took Elsa to the river, and there we rested together. I was happy now and could relax, feeling that her future was assured. She must have felt the same, for she laid her big soft paw on me and dozed off. I was wakened by her raising her head and looking at a bushbuck, whose reddish shape appeared through the foliage on the opposite bank. Elsa watched without interest while the antelope stepped slowly along, unaware of our presence. However happy Elsa might be at the moment, I knew that her lack of interest in the buck was partly due to her full belly. Now that our minds were at ease regarding Elsa's future, we decided to enjoy her company for another short period and wait till an opportunity occurred of making the final break, in some way which would not be too painful. We took up our life where we'd left it off. Although Elsa seldom let us out of her sight, we thought it a good omen that she continued to follow her hunting instinct, and sometimes, when we were on our walks, deserted us for an hour. Once we surprised a warthog coming along to the river for his noonday drink. Elsa stalked him carefully, then, helped by a bullet from George's rifle, seized the pig by the throat and suffocated it. The encounter took place at a little distance from the river, and, as I thought it would be more comfortable for Elsa to guard her kill in the shade by the water, I pointed to the pig and then to the river several times, saying, "Margie, Elsa, Margie, Elsa." She was familiar with the word Margie, which I used when I wanted Nuru to fill her water bowl. Now it seemed she perfectly understood this Swahili word for water, for she dragged her pig to the river. She played with the carcass in the water for nearly 2 hours, splashing and diving with it, and thoroughly enjoying herself until she was quite exhausted. Finally she pulled the pig onto the opposite bank and disappeared with it into a thicket. There she guarded it until it was time for us to return to camp. Then she seemed determined not to be left behind, for as soon as we got up to go, she dragged the kill back to our side. We cut it up before her, and having distributed the meat between Nuru and the gun-bearer, set off with Elsa trotting good-naturedly behind us. From then on, every time Elsa made a kill near the river, she went to great pains to drag it down to the water, and repeated the game she'd had with the warthog. We were at a loss to account for this strange behaviour. Perhaps she'd accepted Margie Elsa as a good rule and as part of her education. These daily excursions brought all of us much closer together, and even Nuru and the gun-bearer felt so much at ease in Elsa's presence that they did not bother to get up when she strolled over to them for a nose-rubbing or sat on them in her playful way. Nor did they mind sharing the back of the Land Rover with her, and when she dumped her 300 pounds between their bony legs, they only laughed and petted her, while she licked their knees with her rough tongue. Early one morning, when we were out on our pre-breakfast walk, Elsa took the lead, and with great determination headed in a set direction, towards a point at which we'd heard much trumpeting of elephant during the night. Suddenly she stopped, sniffing the wind, and with her head stretched out, went off at a fast trot, leaving us behind. A few moments later, in the far distance, we heard the faint call of a lion. She stayed away all that day. Late in the evening we heard her call a long way off, mingled with that of another lion. At dawn we followed Elsa's spoor, and soon found it leading away from camp and mixed up with the pug marks of the other lion. The next day we found her spoor alone. On the 4th day of her absence we tracked her across the river. We searched for her all that day, until we found ourselves unexpectedly in the middle of a herd of elephant. Then there was nothing but to run for it. Early on the 5th morning, Elsa returned very hungry, and ate until her belly was near to bursting point. After that she retired to my camp bed, and made it clear she was not to be disturbed. Later I noticed 2 deep bites and several smaller claw marks on the curve of her hind legs. These I dressed as best I could. She responded affectionately, sucking my thumbs and holding me close. In the afternoon she did not want to go for a walk, and sat on the roof of the Land Rover until dark. Then she disappeared into the night. Some 2 hours later we heard a lion's roar in the distance, and Elsa's immediate reply. At first the sound came from near the camp, but gradually her voice faded away in the direction of the lion. The following morning we decided that this was an opportune moment to leave her alone for another few days, and moved camp so as not to handicap her association with the wild lion, who might take exception to our presence. After a week we returned to our camping place and interrupted Elsa while she was stalking 2 waterbuck. It was early in the afternoon and very hot. Poor thing, she must have been very hungry to be hunting so late in the day. She gave us a touching welcome and gorged herself on the meat we'd brought her. I noticed a new bite on her elbow, and her old wounds were badly in need of dressing. For the next 3 days she made up for her period of starvation. By now Elsa's fame had spread far and wide, and a party of American sportsmen paid us a visit specially to film her. She entertained them royally, and did everything she could to please them. She climbed a tree, played in the river, hugged me, joined us for tea, and behaved in such a docile manner that none of our guests could believe that she was a full-grown lioness, who shortly before they arrived had been equally at ease in the company of wild lions. The rains had now started, and as usual they stimulated Elsa's energy and playfulness. She just had to ambush us from any suitable cover. As among her pride I was her favourite lioness, she honoured me with most of her attentions, and so I was the one who usually found myself on the ground with Elsa's soft but heavy body on top of me, holding me down until George released me. Although I knew it was only affection that singled me out for these privileges, I had to stop this practice, as I was quite unable to get her off me without help. Soon she understood by the tone of my voice that the game was not popular, and it was touching to see how she tried to control her pent-up energy, so that even when she was making a flying leap, she would control it at the last moment and reach me in a dignified manner. One morning we were walking together along the shady river bank, when we noticed basin-shaped circular depressions of mud, about 3 feet in diameter, in a shallow lagoon. George told me they were the breeding places of tilapia, a fish we'd not so far seen in the river. While we investigated these mud hollows, Elsa sniffed with great interest at a bush and wrinkled up her nose, a thing she often did when scenting a lion. Now we saw fresh pug marks nearby, and Elsa, who was purring distinctly, followed the spoor and disappeared. She kept away all night and the following day. When in the afternoon we looked for her, we detected her through field glasses outlined on her favourite rock. She must have seen us, for we heard her calling, but she made no attempt to move from her position. Thinking she might be near wild lands, we did not want to interfere, and returned home. After everyone had gone to bed, George heard the agonized cries of an animal in pain, and after a short time Elsa appeared in the tent and threw herself down next to his bed. She patted him several times with her paws, as though she wanted to tell him something. Then, after a few minutes, she left again, and was absent all night and the following day. While we were having our dinner next evening, she walked into the tent, rubbed her head affectionately against me, and then went out and spent the night away. In the morning we tracked her spoor over a long distance. It led far away. That evening she failed to come back. She had now kept away for 3 days, except for brief visits during which she'd shown us her affection. Might this be her touching way of telling us that she'd found her pride, and while she still loved us, was trying to loosen our ties? During the night we were awakened by the most alarming lion growls, mixed with the laughing of hyenas. We listened, expecting Elsa to come in at any moment, but morning dawned and she did not return. As soon as it became light, we went in the direction from which the growls had come, but stopped after a few hundred yards, startled by an unmistakable lion grunt coming from the river below us. At the same time we saw an antelope and some vervet monkeys racing in flight through the bush. Creeping cautiously through thick undergrowth down to the river, we found the fresh pug marks of at least 2 or 3 lions in the sand. They led across the river. Wading through, we followed the still wet spoor up the opposite bank when I noticed, not 50 yards away through the dense bush, the shape of a lion. While I strained my eyes to see if it was Elsa, George called to her. She walked away from us. When George repeated his call, she only trotted faster along the game path until we saw the black tuft on the end of her tail switch for the last time through the bush. We looked at each other. Had she found her destiny? She must have heard us. By following the lions, she'd decided her future. To us it seemed impossible, after more than 3 years of such close companionship, that we might lose all touch with Elsa, so long as she was willing to keep in touch with us. As George, in the course of his duties, is constantly travelling, we have endeavoured to pay a visit to the area where Elsa lives at intervals of about 3 weeks. On arrival in camp, we always fire a shot or 2, or let off a thunder flash, and on nearly every occasion she's come running into camp within a few hours, giving us a great welcome and showing more affection than ever. Once it was 15 hours before she came, and once 30 hours, when she must have been very far off, and sensed our arrival in some mysterious way. During our 3 days' stay she never lets us out of her sight, and is touchingly glad to be with us. When the time comes for us to leave, George goes about 10 miles away and shoots a buck or warthog as a farewell gift to Elsa, while the tents are being struck and loaded up. In the meantime, I sit with her in my studio under the big tree and try to divert her mind. As soon as the buck arrives, she has a good feed, though we usually find her fat and well. She obviously learned long ago to make her own kills, and is quite independent of us for food. While she is eating, the loaded cars are taken about a mile away, and as she becomes drowsy after her meal, we sneak away. For some time before the final parting, she becomes noticeably aloof and turns her face away from us. Although she wants desperately to be with us, when she realizes we're going, she makes it easier in this touching, dignified, and controlled way. As this happens every time, it can hardly be coincidence. During the months I spent in London preparing the story of Elsa, George wrote me accounts of all his visits to Elsa, and her story was carried on by his letters. They prove not only her continued ability to combine the life of a wild lioness with her old relationship with us, but also that this relationship continues to be one of absolute equality, quite different from that between a dog and his master. In one of his letters, written in May 1959, George said, "There is nothing more that I can tell you about Elsa. I have put every detail in my letters. You know when she is full of meat, she will not go far from camp and just spends the days with me under the studio tree. Unless something very unusual happens, it is the same routine as before you went away. Elsa is certainly more independent and goes farther afield, and no longer has to rely on me for food. She is perhaps a little more suspicious of strange Africans, and will not let Nuru or Makedi come too near when she's with her meat. When it comes to moving the meat, either from the tent to the studio in the morning, or from the studio to the tent in the evening, I have to carry it with Elsa marching behind. She even brings the meat into our little mountain tent, and I just have to put up with it, or if it's too smelly, move my bed outside. Obviously she knows that when the meat is put near me, it's quite safe. I feel sure that when she has cubs, she will bring them along and deposit them with me to look after. When that happens, I do not think it will be possible to have anyone near apart from us. The staff will have to be left behind. I look forward to seeing Elsa again. She was rather pathetic when I left her the last time. I tried to sneak away unseen, but when I looked back she was standing on the edge of the salt lick, watching me go away. She never made any attempt to follow. I felt like a thief stealing away. In his last letter before my return to Africa, George said, "Prepare yourself for a tremendous welcome. In fact, I think it would be best if you did not show yourself until after she's greeted me and settled down a little." The time came for me to return to Africa, and I arrived in Kenya on July the 5th. Before the aircraft landed at Nairobi Airport, and long before I saw George, I saw our Land Rover. It was by far the most battered car amongst the shiny limousines in the parking place. However much I may have blushed at other times to be connected with such a very shabby vehicle, I now felt deeply moved to see it standing there with all its many scratches and dents, where Elsa had left her marks. I suggested to George that we should start straight away to visit her, but he convinced me that we ought first to buy a new Land Rover, as our old friend was literally falling to pieces. And so we had to part with this good but decrepit companion, which was so much part of Elsa, and bought the latest luxury model, which was, of course, much more comfortable and respectable. But we wondered how Elsa would react to it. George had arranged his local leave to coincide with my return, and soon we were on our way to Elsa. When we arrived at her camp on the 12th of July, it was already getting dark. About 20 minutes later, while we were putting up my tent, we heard the barking of baboons coming from the river. These always heralded Elsa's arrival. George suggested that I should get into the truck until Elsa had used up a little of her energy in greeting him, as he was afraid that in her excitement at seeing me after such a long parting, she might not be able to control her great strength and might do me some injury. Rather reluctantly, I followed his advice and watched her welcome him, but after a few minutes I got out. Suddenly she saw me, and as though it were the most natural thing in the world, walked quietly over from George and started rubbing her face against my knees and meowing in her usual way. Then, with claws well tucked in, she used her 300 pounds to bowl me over, after which she played in her usual friendly way without any fuss or excitement. She'd filled out and grown enormously, and I was glad to see that her stomach was full. Owing to this, it was a long time before she showed any interest in the gazelle which George had brought. Later, to our surprise, she jumped onto the roof of the new shiny Land Rover with the same matter-of-factness with which she'd greeted me, though it looked so very different from the old battered vehicle she was used to. For the night we decided that I would put my camp bed into my truck, in case Elsa might feel inclined to share it with me. This proved to be a wise precaution, for soon after the lamps were turned out, she crept determinedly through the thorn fence which surrounded my boma, and standing on her hind legs, looked into the truck and satisfied herself that I was there. However, after this, she settled down next to the car till the early morning. Then I heard her dragging the gazelle carcass down to the river bank, where she guarded it until George got up and called for breakfast. Then she reappeared and was about to make a flying leap towards me, but when I called, "No, Elsa, no," she quickly controlled herself and walked up quietly. While we ate, she sat with one paw touching me. Then she returned to her neglected kill. For the next 6 days, Elsa shared our camp routine and our morning and evening walks. One day we watched her stalk a waterbuck while he was drinking on the other side of the river. She froze, rigid, in a most uncomfortable attitude, till he gave her a chance to move swiftly downwind, then, crossing the river without the slightest splash, disappeared in the bush. When she returned, she rubbed her head against us, as if to tell us about the obvious failure of her hunt. On another occasion we surprised a large bird of prey on the body of a freshly killed dik-dik. When it left its victim, we offered this little antelope to Elsa, but she refused it, wrinkling up her nose in her usual grimace at anything she did not like. Another time we picnicked downriver for a day's fishing, and I sat making sketches of her. As soon as I started eating my sandwiches, she insisted on getting her share and tried with her big paws to snatch them from my mouth. At other moments she was not so gentle, and we had to be on the alert to avoid her playful ambushes, for she'd become so strong now that the impact of her heavy body was certainly no mutual pleasure. One morning she had a wonderful game in the river with a stick which George had thrown her. She retrieved it, leapt in cabrioles around it, splashing all the water which she could whip up with her tail, dropped the stick again, only to have an excuse to dive for it and bring it proudly to the surface. While George was filming her near the water's edge, she pretended not to notice him, but cunningly manoeuvred herself closer and closer. Then she suddenly dropped the stick and leapt on the poor fellow as if to say, "That's for you, you photographer." When George tried to get his revenge, she hopped away and with unbelievable swiftness climbed a sloping tree trunk out of everyone's reach. There she sat, licking her paws, looking innocent. After this performance, Elsa paid us only short visits for the next 2 days and became very detached. On the 23rd she did not come for our morning walk, but in the late afternoon we observed her outlined on the rock ridge near camp, and could hardly believe our eyes when we saw a whole troop of baboons within 20 yards, apparently quite unconcerned. Very reluctantly she answered our call and joined us at the foot of the rock, but soon afterwards walked away as fast as she could into the bush. We followed until it was dark. Later she came back to us and put up with my patting her, but was obviously restless and uneasy and wanted to go off. All that night and the next day she was away, only coming once for a quick meal. The following day, while we were talking after supper, she suddenly appeared, dripping wet from having crossed the river. She greeted George and me affectionately, but while eating her dinner she constantly stopped to listen to something outside. By morning she was gone. This strange behaviour puzzled us. She showed no sign of being in season, and we began to wonder whether we had outstayed our welcome. This was far the longest we'd spent with her since her release. Next evening again, at dinner-time, Elsa suddenly appeared out of the darkness and with one swish of her tail swept everything off the table. After embracing us with rather excessive affection, she went off into the night, though she returned for a brief moment as if to apologize. Next morning, the explanation for her strange behavior was written plain in the pug marks of a large lion. In the afternoon we saw through our field glasses a lot of vultures circling and went to investigate. We found the spoors of many hyenas and jackals, and the pug marks of a lion. These led towards the river, where the lion had no doubt drunk, and had left a large pool of blood-soaked sand. But there was no sign of Elsa's tracks, and no kill to account either for the vultures or for the blood. We spent 6 hours searching the surrounding area, but had to return to camp without solving the mystery. That evening Elsa came in very hungry and spent the night with us, but was gone by dawn. On the 29th we saw her on the high rock ridge, and after a few minutes' calling she joined us, purring repeatedly and affectionately, but soon returned to her rock. Now we saw that she was in season, which explained her recent behavior. When we visited her again in the afternoon, although she replied to our calls, she would not come down, and we had to climb up the rock. When it was getting dark, she got up, and as if saying good-bye to us, rubbed her head against me, George, and the gun-bearer, and then walked slowly towards her lie-up. Only once did she look back at us. Next day I saw her through my field glasses resting on her rock. If she could have spoken, she could hardly have told us more convincingly that she wanted to be left alone. However much affection we gave her, it was plain she needed the company of her own kind. We decided to break camp. As our 2 cars passed below her rock, she appeared on the skyline and watched us driving away. Our next visit to Elsa was between the 18th and the 23rd of August. She was, as usual, most affectionate while she was with us, but out of these 5 days she spent 2 alone in the bush, and although we did not see the spoor of a lion, she seemed to prefer solitude to sharing our life. On the 29th of August, George was obliged to go to Elsa's area for game control, and arrived at 6 p.m. at her camp to spend the night there. He fired off 2 thunder flashes to attract her attention. At about 8 p.m. he heard a lion downriver and let off another thunder flash. The lion continued to call throughout the night, but there was no sign of Elsa. Next morning George found the pug marks of a young lion or lioness close to camp. He had to leave immediately afterwards, but returned at 4 p.m. An hour later, Elsa came across the river, looking very fit and full of affection. Although she was not hungry, she ate a little of the buck which George had brought her, and then dragged the carcass into the tent. Soon after dark, a lion began to call. Much to George's surprise, she completely ignored the invitation, which continued throughout most of the night. Early next morning she made a hearty meal, and then, without any show of hurry, disappeared in the direction from which the lion had called. Shortly afterwards, George heard her voice and saw her sitting on a big rock, and heard her making deep grunts. As soon as she spotted him, she came down and met him, but although pleased to see him, made it obvious that she wanted to be alone, and after a brief head-rubbing, disappeared into the bush. Guessing the direction she'd taken, George followed her, and found her running tracks heading for the river. Presently he saw her sitting on a rock, almost hidden by a bush. He watched her for some time. She seemed very restless, and kept on looking intently downstream. First she meowed, and then, with a startled "huh, huh," dashed down the rock and streaked past George into the bush. Next moment a young lion appeared, evidently in hot pursuit, and not sensing George, came straight towards him. When the lion was less than 20 yards away, George thought it time to act, and waved his arms and shouted. Startled, the beast spun round and made off the way he'd come. A few seconds later Elsa reappeared, squatted nervously close to George for a few moments, and then followed the lion. George withdrew and moved camp. 2 days later he had to revisit the same area. A few hundred yards before reaching Elsa's camp, one of the men in the car saw her under a bush close to the track, apparently hiding. Most unusual behavior, for normally she would rush out to meet the car and greet everyone. Thinking the man might have mistaken a wild lioness for Elsa, George turned the car and drove back. There she was, sitting under the bush. At first she made no movement. Then, realizing that she had been caught out, she came forward and was courtesy itself, making a great fuss of George and pretending to be as pleased as ever at seeing him, and she condescended to eat some of the meat he'd brought her. While she was eating, George walked up the track to look for spoor. He found her pug marks together with those of another lion. Then he saw the lion himself peeping at him from behind a bush. It appeared to be the same one which he'd seen with Elsa a few days earlier. Presently there was an uproar from a troop of baboons by the river, which heralded the approach of the lion. Hearing this, Elsa hurriedly finished her meal and went off to find her lord and master. George went on and pitched camp, and left the remainder of the meat in the tent for Elsa before going on to do his work. On his return to camp, the meat was still untouched, and Elsa did not appear during the night. In December, Elsa disappeared for the longest period ever, and we could find no trace of her. On December the 25th we returned to camp after a fruitless search and began a very gloomy Christmas meal. Suddenly there was a swift movement, and Elsa was among us, as effusive as ever. We suspected that our hopes had been fulfilled, and Elsa now had a family of her own. And we were right. Although George saw the cubs some days later, I did not see them until they were several weeks old. I was writing in my studio one afternoon when the boy came running up to say that Elsa was calling in a strange voice from across the river. I quickly followed the sound, and as I broke through the undergrowth, I saw Elsa standing on a sandbank, with 2 cubs at her side, and a third still on the far bank, too timid to cross. From that day, Elsa and her cubs were regular visitors to the camp. At first we wondered whether we should discourage this, but as Elsa had not had the advantage of a pride to help her raise her family, we felt it right to stay and fill its place. So began an exciting new relationship with Elsa and her family. But that is another story.